Chapter 1151. Li Yi had been away from the capital for 5 years, and the capital had undergone earth-shattering changes. These changes were not only visible on the outside. Some of the landmark buildings were still there, but he was no longer familiar with most of the streets. The new generation had replaced the old in the court. The former Minister of Revenue, Qin Huan, had resigned due to illness 3 years ago, and Seng Shichen had replaced him. The Ministry of Revenue was busy and could not afford to be distracted. After becoming the Minister of Revenue, Seng Shichen naturally could not hold the position of the capital governor. The capital governor, Lu Dao's daughter-in-law of many years, had finally become a mother-in-law. With her keen political sense, she had become the capital governor as she wished. In addition, the Minister of Justice had also resigned due to illness, and the former Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice, Lu Yi, had temporarily replaced him. This period lasted for 2 years. His second uncle, Li Mingzi, did not become the Minister of the Ministry of Personnel, but was transferred to the central government of the 3 provinces. At his age, there was still hope for him to be promoted in his future career. The old generals in the court also resigned one after another in the first year after the former emperor's death. During these 5 years, many young generals had been trained for the Jing Kingdom through the military academy. Li Yi had received this information over the years. What he was looking at now was the tidying up of the intelligence reports over the years. Li Duan walked out from inside and walked to his side. Suddenly, he smelled a familiar fragrance. He sniffed and said, "Dad, I want to eat egg fried rice." Li Yi put down the things in his hands, stood up, and walked to the kitchen. Li Duan happily followed behind and said, "Dad, can I let Xiao Rui taste your cooking in the future?" The 6-year-old Li Duan could already read. In these 2 years he and Xiao Rui had exchanged letters. Of course, most of the time, it was him who spoke and Li Yi who wrote. The content of the letters was very childish. It was mostly about how much he had grown, and how he could jump from the ground to the top of the wall. He also promised to show it to her when they met in the future. Li Yi took out the steamed rice and casually asked, "Duaner, do you want Xiao Rui to be your wife in the future?" "Of course." Li Duan nodded his head vigorously and said, "We've agreed that when we grow up, I'll marry her so that we can always play together." "If that's the case." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "Then why don't you make your own egg fried rice for little Rui to eat? If little Rui likes to eat the rice you make, she will often come to find you." Li Duan had a pensive look on his face, as if he was considering it. After thinking for a while, he walked to Li Yi and said, "Dad, teach me how to cook." Li Yi handed him an egg and said, "Crack this egg first. If you want to capture a woman's heart, you must first capture a woman's stomach." This was a principle that Li Yi wanted to teach Li Duan. The men of the Li family could be useless in other things, but they couldn't not know how to cook. After eating his egg fried rice, Emingzi couldn't eat other people's cooking. She couldn't leave him for the rest of her life. This was the best example. When Li Xian wanted Li Duan and little Rui to be betrothed, he didn't agree. However, the 2 children grew up together. If they really liked each other, he wouldn't stop them. If Li Xian made similar requests in the future, he could consider agreeing first. After all, Li Xian was very experienced in giving birth to daughters. He had already given birth to 3 daughters in succession, 4th year of Jingping, 5th of November. Today was the first day of Princess Shaning's husband selection. Li Yi was wearing the mask that Su Zheng had prepared for him. When he walked out of the door, he saw 2 people coming in from outside. The 17-year-old Duan Wu had already become slender and elegant. She was no longer the plain girl he first met. Li Han was also not as fat as before. The genes of the Li Xian family were very good. Among the princes and princesses, none of them were ugly. The 17-year-old Li Han's childishness had long faded. He was a graceful and beautiful young man. However, the beautiful young man looked anxious at the moment. As he chased after the girl in front of him, he explained, "Duan Wu, believe me, I really have nothing to do with that sister of the Wang family. She just treats me as a brother." "She treats you as a brother or something else? What does it have to do with me?" Duan Wu glanced at him and walked into the house. When she saw Li Yi coming out from inside, a happy expression appeared on her face. She hurried over, but stopped halfway. Only then did she remember that the news of her brother's return couldn't be told to anyone. Li rubbed her head and realized that the girl now was no longer the little girl from before. As soon as he let go of his hand, a voice came to his ears. Li Han stood in front of Duanwu and looked at Li Yi. He said with vigilance, "Who are you?" Duanwu came out from behind him and said with dissatisfaction, "Li Han, what are you doing?" Li looked at him and asked, "Do you like my sister?" Duanwu blushed and twisted her hands together. She whispered, "Brother." Li Han was startled and asked, "You are Duanwu's brother?" Li nodded his head and said, "Although you are Prince Jin, if you want to pursue my sister, you still have to pass through me first." Although Li Han didn't know where Duanwu's brother came from, at this time, of course he couldn't be weak. He straightened his chest and asked, "What do you want me to pass?" "I recently encountered a difficult problem in mathematics. As long as you can solve it, I will allow you to pursue my sister." Li Han almost laughed in his heart. It seemed that Duanwu's brother still didn't know that he was the dean of the mathematics school. In the whole capital, the whole Jin kingdom, and the whole world, who was he afraid of? He was afraid of one person, but that person wasn't in the capital. He wasn't here, so the field of mathematics was his, Li Han's world. He looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, "What is the problem? Tell me." "It's very simple. You just need to help me prove that any even number greater than 2 can be written as the sum of 2 prime numbers." Li looked at him and said, "I still have some things to do. When this problem is proven, come back here to find me." After Li Yi finished speaking, he turned around and walked out. If he delayed any longer, he would miss the first written exam. There were a lot of people participating in this written exam. Just the exam venue alone, there were more than 100, and it involved more than 10 academies in the capital. Coincidentally, Li Yi's exam venue was Shaning Academy. This was the academy that he had given to Shaning many years ago. He entered the academy, took out his token, found the classroom, and walked in. The exam had not started yet. There were about 40 to 50 people in the exam venue. They were all sitting at their desks, looking straight ahead, quietly waiting for the exam to start. "Brother, do you want the latest version of the secret prediction scroll?" Not long after Li Yi sat down, he suddenly heard a voice. He turned his head and saw a fat man. The fat man saw him and exclaimed, "It's you." Li Yi had a deep impression of this fat man. This was because when he first arrived in the capital, before he even stepped through the city gates, he was sold a set of leaked secret scrolls. The fat man had an even deeper impression of him. The person in front of him was the only one who bought a secret scroll that was worth 10 taels of silver from him for 5 copper coins. Li looked at him and asked, "What, there's a new secret prediction scroll?" This fat man was also a talent. He could actually sneak into the exam venue and sell fake exam papers to the examinees. He realized that all the fat men he knew were good at doing business. Li looked at him and said, "Same rules, one price, 5 copper coins." The fat man looked at him and silently walked to the front of an examinee. He asked in a low voice, "Brother, the latest version of the secret prediction scroll is sold cheaply for 10 taels of silver. Do you want it?" That person turned his head to look at him and said in surprise, "There really is a secret prediction scroll? Really?" This fatty clearly had a nimble tongue. He was extremely eloquent, and his tongue was like a lotus flower. After circling around the exam hall, his bulging belly actually reduced a bit. He walked in front of Li Yi again, and pulled out a test paper from his belly. He said, "This is the last one. 5 words it is." Li Yi touched the cuffs of his waist and looked at him. He said, "I'm sorry, I didn't bring any money with me." The fat man angrily sat down next to Li Yi and didn't say another word. 5 copper coins was fine, but he actually wanted to take it for free. He had seen black-hearted people, but he had never seen someone as black-hearted as himself. Just as he sat down, an examiner came in from outside. He scanned the crowd and said seriously, "Anything unrelated to the exam, put it all at the front. If it is discovered during the exam, it will be treated as cheating and your right to take the exam will be revoked." Li looked at those people dejectedly, put the papers they had just bought on the table. A few more people walked down and carefully checked the papers. The examiner then cleared his throat and announced, "The written exam will now begin. Chapter 1152. All the academies in the capital city heard the bell ringing from the imperial palace. The written exam officially began. Li Yi had already received his exam paper. The questions on the paper covered a wide range of topics, including poetry, classics, governance, and even science. However, the first few questions on the paper made Li Yi smile. Without thinking, he picked up the pen and began to write. However, when the other examinees received the paper and skimmed through it, their hearts immediately sank. They cursed the fat man who had just sold them the paper. Damn it, they had spent dozens of taels of silver on the secret test paper, but none of the questions were correct. What was more hateful was that in order to memorize the questions on the secret test paper, they had already stayed up for several nights. They might as well not have bought it. However, they did not dare to curse for too long in their hearts. After all, the exam only lasted for 4 hours. All the grudges would be settled after the exam. When they were about to answer the questions, they were stunned again. The first question: ignoring air resistance, if 2 stones, one light and one heavy, fall from the same height, which one will land first? There were 4 options below. A. The heavy one. B. The light one. C. The 2 will land at the same time. D. I don't know. The second question. Wang Xiaoming's father had 3 sons. The eldest son was called Da Mao, the second son was called Mao, and what was the third son's name? There were 4 options below as well. A. San Mao. B. 4 Mao. C. 50. D. Wang Xiaoming. The third question was very simple. There was only one sentence. How many plum trees were planted in hibiscus garden? The first question was needless to say. 2 stones fell at the same time. This was verified by the emperor himself, so they could not get it wrong. The second question seemed inexplicable, but it was actually a math question. The eldest son was called Da Mao, the second son was called Mao, and the third son was definitely called San Mao. As for the third question, how would they know how many plum trees were planted in hibiscus garden? The third question was skipped. Fortunately, the following questions were starting to move in a normal direction. Time was limited, so the examinees began to write quickly. Outside the examination room, there were also examiners gathered together to analyze a paper. They were satisfied with the overall quality of the paper, but they were also helpless about the first 3 questions. The first 2 questions were set by the emperor himself, so they did not dare to raise any objections. The question of the 2 stones falling to the ground had already been decided. If anyone still answered incorrectly, they would have to suspect that they were spies sent by other countries. Even if they were not, they would be too ignorant and disrespectful to His Majesty if they did not even know the famous law of free fall. Therefore, anyone who answered incorrectly on the first question would be directly eliminated. As for the second question, they could only interpret it as saying that the person who answered this question incorrectly might have something wrong with his head. And geniuses with brain problems would naturally not be able to marry princesses. Those who answered this question incorrectly would also be directly eliminated. The third question was set by Princess Shining herself. They did not know how many plum trees were in hibiscus garden. They did not know how many plum trees there were in hibiscus garden. They did not know how many plum trees in hibiscus garden, but this question had no. If one answered the first 2 questions correctly, he would be able to proceed to the combat test directly, no matter how he answered the rest of the questions correctly. If they were, and would, they would palace, academy and would, emperor would, and would in dynasty. There was an 80% chance that he would eliminate the person who answered the question incorrectly. As for the third question, there was no doubt that it was set by Shining. In her previous letters, she had said that she had given each of the 36 plum trees in hibiscus garden a name. She had already been very restrained by not asking these people what the 10th plum tree was called. He spaced out for a while, then continued to answer. Not far from him, the fat man bit the shaft of his pen, lost in thought. He didn't take the exam to marry the princess, but to make money by selling fake exam papers. Therefore, he did not intend to answer. However, if he handed in a blank paper, would he be arrested for disrespecting the princess? He couldn't take this risk, but he also couldn't answer too well. If he passed the written exam, he would definitely be beaten to death by those who had spent a lot of money to buy his exam papers. To be safe, he would only answer the first 3 questions. He picked up his pen and looked at the first question. Ignoring air resistance, if 2 stones, one light and one heavy, fell from the same height, which one would land first? There was no need to choose, it must be the heavy one. However, to be safe, he still intended to choose the wrong one. Choosing the heavy one was right, but choosing the light one seemed to be a bit too stupid. He didn't know if it was a bit too perfunctory, so he just randomly chose the one that landed at the same time. After choosing the C option, he continued to look at the next question. Wang Xiaoming's father had 3 sons. The eldest son was called Damao, the second son was called Ermao, and what was the third son's name? He was a bit suspicious of the intention of the person who came up with the questions. 2 consecutive free marks questions would not be able to pull everyone apart. The eldest son was called Damao, the second son was called Ermao, and the third son was definitely called Sanmao. The one who chose 45 was because he had never studied mathematics. To be safe, he still had to answer this question incorrectly. Well, he would choose Wang Xiaoming. When he saw the third question, he finally frowned. How would he know how many plum trees there were in Hibiscus Garden? When he was about to fill in a random number, he turned to look at the stingy guy beside him, and happened to see his answer. 36. He wrote 36 on the bar, then got up, handed in his paper, and left the examination room. If he left late, he was afraid that he would be surrounded outside and beaten to death. In less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea, some people handed in their papers early and left the examination room, causing a commotion in the examination room. Li Yi was not disturbed. Although most of these questions relied on memory and could be solved by cheating, it still took a lot of time to finish all the questions. 2 hours later, the bell rang again, and all the examination rooms in the capital handed in their papers at the same time. Everyone walked out of the examination room, some frowning, and some high-spirited. Hey, I didn't finish. I almost finished it. Who knows how many plum trees there are in Hibiscus Garden? What about the fat guy who sold the papers? He didn't get a single question right. I'll beat him to death. Is there a mistake in the second question? Damao, Ermao, Sanmao and Wang Xiaoming, shouldn't there be 4 sons? How can it be 3? I pointed out the mistake in the question. Do you think they will give me extra marks? The imperial court placed great importance on the theory examination this time. After the examination ended, the imperial army would immediately transport all the examination papers to the palace. There would be nearly 100 teachers from the academy who would finish grading all the examination papers within a day. According to the rankings, the 100 talents who would enter the Wushu examination would be selected. In Hibiscus Garden, Shouning looked at his imperial mother and said with dissatisfaction, "It's clearly me choosing the emperor's son-in-law, but I can only come up with half a question. Even imperial brother can come up with 2 questions. This is not fair." Concubine Yin looked at her and said, "If you didn't ask them what the name of the 10th plum tree in Hibiscus Garden is, you could also give 2 more questions." A eunuch came in with a tray and said respectfully, "Concubine Yin, all the papers have been marked. The papers of the top 100 are all here." Concubine Yin took out a paper and frowned. Looking at the blank paper, she asked, "What's going on?" The eunuch bowed and said, "Concubine Yin, although this person only answered 3 questions, he is one of the 2 who answered the first 3 questions correctly. According to the rules, he can enter the Wushu examination directly." Concubine Yin thought for a while and asked, "Who is the other person?" "The other person is the only one who answered all the questions and got full marks." The eunuch said respectfully, "He is the first in this written examination." "What's his name?" "Muzi." "Muzi." Shouning took a deep breath and walked over. She said, "Where is his paper? Show it to me." The eunuch handed her the paper at the top. She took the paper but didn't open it immediately. She even looked away. After taking another deep breath, she slowly opened it. After a long time, she closed the paper and put it back gently. She covered her face and pinched it. Suddenly she looked at Concubine Yin and asked, "Mother, have I gained weight recently?" Concubine Yin nodded and said, "I told you to eat less." Ah. She was shocked. She quickly ran to her room and stood in front of the mirror. She pulled her elastic face and said in distress, I've really gained weight. What should I do? What should I do? After being distressed for a while, a smile appeared on her face again. She threw herself on the bed and rolled around while giggling. As she giggled, she quickly sat up and tidied her clothes and hair. She stood in front of the mirror and smiled like a lady. It was only a day before the written examination. On the high palace wall, there was a huge red list. This was the list of 100 people who passed the written examination and entered the Wushu examination. There were thousands of people who participated in the written examination. In the end, there were only 100 people left. Most people just came to take a look and left with a sigh. Naturally, there were also those who were on the list. They stood under the list with a face full of surprise and didn't want to leave for a long time. This Mu Zi is a beast. He even got full marks for that kind of paper. It's not just that. I heard that even Prime Minister Shen and a few officials in the court were full of praise for his political analysis. They said that most of the officials in the court can't compare to him. Also, that poem of his has spread like wildfire in the imperial court. Some people even say that his attainments in poetry are on par with King Jing's. Luckily, there's still the Wushu examination. When the time comes, we must unite and get rid of him first. Who is that Ping Heir? He's actually ranked second. I've never heard of him before. The capital is really full of hidden talents. Under the imperial list, there was a lot of noise. Some people made it onto the list and laughed wildly. Some people failed, crying and snot. In a corner of the crowd, a fat man looked at the name on the imperial list. His face was ashen and his body was shaking like a sieve. His lips trembled and he couldn't help but mumble, "It's shady, shady, shady." Chapter 1153. After the written test, the combat test would be held 7 days later. For 5 consecutive days, Li Yi did not see Li Han even once. According to Duan Wu, Li Han had locked himself in the mathematics school and had not come out for 5 whole days. Prove that any even number greater than 2 can be written as the sum of 2 prime numbers. This question seemed to only have one line of words, but it had troubled the mathematics world for nearly 300 years. This was the world's most famous problem, Goldbach's conjecture, codenamed 1 + 1 = 2. Back then, even Euler, who was known as the greatest mathematician on Earth, could not prove it. Then this problem caused the mathematics world to study for nearly 300 years. Until the day Li Yi went to the library to freeload, no one had proved it. If Li Han really proved this proposition, Li Yi would worship him and offer him at least 3 sticks of incense every day. It was good for a young man to be confident, but he must not be arrogant. Li Han was very smart, but he had a big weakness. If he did not encounter a setback for a long time, he would become arrogant. After 5 years, if he did not wake up, he would become arrogant. He would not know that there was always someone better than him, and each question would be more difficult than the previous one. Duan Wu grabbed his arm and whispered, "Brother, he has been working hard these few days. Don't make it difficult for him." Li nodded and said, Okay. I won't make it difficult for him. Our little Duan Wu also knows how to care about him." Looking at Duan Wu's red face, Li thought that Li Han had grown up these few years. He was no longer the silly little fatty who only knew how to do math. "Aunt Duan Wu, I'm here to play with you." A crisp voice rang in Li Yi's ears. Then a young girl of about 5 or 6 years old ran in from outside. She looked like she was carved from jade. Li Han followed behind her. His eyes were sunken and he looked exhausted. Li Han looked up and stammered, Little Rue came to play with you. I have to look after her." Li Yi still remembered that when they left the capital, Xiao Rue was just like Li Duan, swaying as she walked. When he looked at the little girl at the door again, he couldn't help but feel a little unreal. In the blink of an eye, she had already grown so big. She said that she was here to play with Duan Wu, but in fact, she only stood at the door for a while before running out. It seemed like Li Han's tricks were deeper than he had imagined. Even such a young child was treated as his wingman. Li Han walked over and pursed his lips. He looked at Li Yi and said, "Then that question, I can't prove it. What should I do?" Li Yi shook his head. "I don't know either." Li Han stared at him with widened eyes. You don't know?" He thought that the reason he said he didn't know was to test him, but he didn't expect that he really didn't know. Could it be that he had spent the past few days studying an unsolvable question without sleep or food? In this world, not every question has an answer. Li looked at him and said, "Don't think that there is no problem in the world that you can't solve just because you have studied mathematics for a few years. Mathematics is far from as simple as you think." How familiar were these words? How familiar was this scene? Li Han looked at the person in front of him, and suddenly felt his legs turn to jelly. The same tone, the same words. If it wasn't for the fact that he had never seen this distant cousin of Duanwu before, he would have thought that it was Sir standing in front of him again. He lowered his head and said with a trembling voice, "I know. Young master, come down quickly. Young master, be careful. Young master, it's dangerous." A few maids from the Li family stood under the tree and raised their heads. Their faces were full of worry, and even their faces were a little pale from fright. "It's okay, it's not high at all." Li Duan looked down and waved his hand. He threw down the kuju from a branch and said, "Go and play. If you kick the tree again, come and call me." He jumped down from the tree and clapped his hands. When he turned around, he found a little girl standing under the porch looking at him. "Who are you? Why have I never seen you before?" The first to speak was the little girl. She saw Li Duan jump down from such a high tree. She was shocked at first, but when she saw him land steadily, she was surprised and envious. Li Duan looked at her and said strangely, "I have never seen you before either." The little girl looked at him and asked again, "Do you know martial arts?" "Of course." Li Duan was a little proud and said, "My martial arts is very powerful. Even the adults can't beat me." The little girl saw his proud look and curled her lips. She thought that Dwainer was definitely more powerful than him. Dwainer said in the letter last time that he could jump from the ground to the wall. However, she wasn't sure who was more powerful between him and Dwainer. She thought for a moment and said, "My little aunt is very powerful. You definitely can't beat her." Li Duan looked at her and asked, unconvinced, "How powerful is your little aunt?" The little girl thought for a moment and pointed to the roof at the side. She said, "My little aunt can fly to the roof in an instant." Li Duan looked at the high roof and felt a little guilty. He could jump down from the roof, but he couldn't jump up from below. If he bragged now and the little girl asked him to prove it, he would lose face. However, he didn't want to show weakness in front of this little girl. He said, "What's so difficult about that? I, Xiaonyang, can also fly to the roof in an instant. Then my big aunt can fly to 2 roofs. My little aunt can fly to 3 roofs. My father can fly to 10 roofs, 100 roofs." The little girl thought for a moment. Her father had a pair of big wings and could fly very high. He must be able to reach 100 roofs. It wasn't a lie. 100? Who didn't know how to brag? Anyway, she was the one who started it. Li Duan thought for a moment and said, "My master can fly to the sun." The little girl's expression froze. She couldn't think of anything higher than the sun. Her father said that the sun was a big fireball. She thought for a moment and asked, "Isn't it hot for your master to fly to the sun?" "Stupid." Li Duan looked at her and said proudly, "Can't we fly at night?" The little girl frowned and said, "That's your master, not you." "Then you're not talking about you." Li Duan looked at her and said, "I just need to fly higher than you. Can you fly to the tree?" The little girl ran away angrily. This bad guy bullied her. When would Dwainer come back? When Dwainer came back, he would be able to protect her. Li Duan curled his lips. This little girl liked to boast so much at such a young age. When she grew up, she would definitely be a big talker. Little Rue was the best. Her father said that in 2 days, she could go find little Rue. He hadn't seen little Rue for a long time. He wondered what she looked like now. He ran to his room and confirmed with Li Yi that he would see little Rue in 2 days. Only then did he relax. However, he didn't know if his nose was bad these days. Why did he always smell the smell of egg fried rice on his father's body? Several days had passed since Princess Shanning's written examination to choose her husband. Tomorrow was the day of the martial examination. The location of the martial examination was in Hibiscus Garden. Early the next morning, other than Princess Shanning, the Empress Dowager, the old consort, the current emperor, the empress, the noble consort, and the regent, the eldest princess, would all appear. Of course, at that time, the civil and military officials of the court, and the nobles of the capital would all enter to observe. This was the largest event in the capital at the end of the 4th year of Jingping. In Hibiscus Garden, Shanning looked at the clothes on the bed and said in distress, "What should I wear tomorrow?" Yan Fei stood behind her, and gently knocked her on the head. "After they finish competing tomorrow, you will have to personally go on stage. You can't wear any of these clothes." Hearing this, Shanning threw herself onto the bed again and muttered, "Then I won't be pretty." What won't you be pretty in?" Yan Fei pinched her face and said, "Go borrow a set of clothes from your sister. You can wear her old training clothes tomorrow." Shanning climbed up from the bed and said, Since I can't win tomorrow, I might as well wear something nice." Morning Dew Palace. In front of Emingzu was a plate of egg-fried rice. The catering bureau hadn't made egg-fried rice in 5 years, but these days, every time it was lunch, a plate would be placed in front of her. A female official walked in from outside and bowed. "Your Highness, everything has been arranged." Emingzu nodded. "I understand." The female official hesitated for a moment and asked, "But Princess, tomorrow with His Majesty and the Empress Dowager, what should we do?" "I have my own arrangements," Emingzu said. She picked up a spoon and began to eat. "Yes." The female official nodded and slowly retreated. Somewhere in the capital, a fatty was carrying a bulging bag. When he sneaked out of his house, he was stopped by a group of imperial guards. This fatty, who had answered the first 3 questions correctly, had been specially instructed by his superiors not to make any mistakes. The imperial guard looked at him and asked, "Young Master Peng, tomorrow is the day of the combat examination. Where are you going?" The fatty's bag fell to the ground and his face instantly turned pale. He hugged the imperial guard's leg and cried, "I deserve to die. I'm not human. I won't sell fake goods anymore. Let me go, let me go." Chapter 1154. 7 days ago, there were a total of 100 people who stood out from thousands of other candidates and participated in today's combat examination. The combat examination was held in Hibiscus Garden. The order of the 100 people would be changed, and they would be divided into 10 groups. Each group would have 1 winner. As long as they could defeat Princess Shanning, they would become the prince's son-in-law. Of course, if 2 or more people defeated the princess, they would have to compete with each other again. In the end, only 1 son-in-law would be left. As for whether the groups would be unfair or not, there would only be 1 son-in-law. There was no difference between the 2nd and the 100th place. The courtiers were very worried about this. Everyone knew that although Princess Ning was a woman, she was well versed in both the pen and the sword. Her martial arts skills were extremely outstanding. Last year, when the imperial court was recruiting martial arts scholars, she secretly disguised herself as a man and forced her way into the top 10. At that time, the officials had already realized that Princess Ning had few rivals among her peers, even those who were 1 or 2 generations older than her. Those who were more skilled than her had been practicing martial arts for many years, and would not be able to participate in the combat examination. Of course, this was something that the prince's son-in-law had to worry about. The officials were happy to see this. In the middle of Hibiscus Garden, there were 10 arenas set up on a large empty plot of land. The officials of the capital were not outside. Instead, they were in a large hall. There was wine and food as they chatted with each other. They did not care about the competition outside. In a while, when the final 10 people were selected, they would come here. A few white-bearded elders sat together, their faces beaming with joy. In this year's prince consort selection, there were many good seedlings. They are worth paying attention to. That Mu Zi is definitely a talented minister. Even I am ashamed of myself when it comes to politics. Forget it. You make it sound like other than politics, you can't compare to him in anything else. In the entire capital, there are not many who can compare to him in poetry. He even reminds me of the Jiang of Silla. The strange thing is, I have never heard of such a person before. To be compared to the Jiang of Silla, that is too much of an exaggeration. Actually, other than this mysterious Muzi, there are a few others who performed well. Inside the hall, the officials and nobles of the imperial court were enjoying the show, not minding the matter from getting out of hand. Beside the arena in Hibiscus Garden, the people who had already been assigned to their respective groups had worried expressions. A scholarly-looking young man suddenly waved his hand with a face full of resentment. The written examination is just a written examination. Why do we have to compete in martial arts? This is a disgrace to the cultured, simply a disgrace to the cultured. The person beside him nodded in agreement and said, "We are here to bring peace to the world. How can we act like boorish men?" A eunuch walked over and said, "Gentlemen, please enter the arena." Hearing this, the two of them silently walked up the stage. It was not easy to stand out from thousands of people. Even if it was a disgrace to them, they would not let go of this opportunity. The rules for the second round of combat examinations were simple. There were no rules. There were 10 arenas, and after the time it takes for an incense stick to burn, the person standing on each of the arenas would be the victor, and would be able to enter the inner sanctum and proceed to the final stage. There were many spectators around the arena. As a eunuch lit the incense and announced the start of the combat examination, the atmosphere on the arena changed immediately. Even the judges at the side of the arena could not believe what they were seeing. They had seen young talents writing beautiful essays in the examination hall, but they had never seen a frail scholar who fought with each other, scratched their faces, and used all sorts of methods to seduce them. Thinking about it carefully, it was not strange for such a scene to occur. It was rare to find someone who was well versed in both literature and martial arts. The first round of the written examination was extremely difficult. Those who remained in this round were mostly talented scholars. There were many who did not even have the strength to truss a chicken. It was fine for them to write essays, but it was better for them to compete in martial arts. Of course, the 10 arenas were not all so unsightly. There were 2 arenas where 2 young talents from the capital's aristocratic families were fighting. They had martial arts skills, and the rest of the people on the arenas were quickly cleared out by them. There was another arena where 9 people gathered together, which was a rare sight. They were chasing after a fatty and beating him up. No one knew what was going on. The strangest was probably the first arena. There were only 2 people on the first arena. The 2 of them stood on one side of the arena, motionless. Li only realized that there was only one person left on the other side after clearing out the few people who were rushing towards him. The person wore a hood that covered his face, and it was difficult to see clearly from the outside. The person's body was also covered by a loose robe, and it was difficult to see anything. Other than Li himself, this was another weirdo who did not want to show his true face to others. The other party did not move, and neither did Li. He did not move because the person on the other side was very powerful, very powerful. Li had just taught Li Han yesterday that there would always be someone better than him. He did not expect that in just one day, some things would come true for him. He thought that he had a lot of cheats in his life, and now he could not find a match for anyone below the Grandmaster level. Obviously, he was a frog at the bottom of a well. The person on the other side was obviously not a Grandmaster, but he did not have the confidence to defeat him. Li did not move, and so the person on the other side moved. He was very fast, and there was even a residual shadow in front of Li. Li's figure swayed and disappeared on the spot. At the same time, the person's figure appeared where he was just a moment ago. Li suddenly smelled a familiar fragrance. It was not the fragrance of perfume. It was the fragrance of Emingzu. Emingzu. He opened his eyes wide, and because he was so shocked, he even used his original voice. The figure was about to move, but after hearing his voice, it suddenly stopped. Li could feel a pair of shocked eyes looking at him from under the hood. He quickly walked over, but the figure hidden under the hood suddenly took a few steps back, jumped directly off the arena, and soon disappeared from his sight. Li stood alone in the arena, a little confused. What was going on? Emingzi disguised as a man, and fought with him over Shanning? Li himself was shocked, not to mention the audience below. The person in the hood just now actually created a residual shadow. He must be an expert. They were excited, but the opponent suddenly gave up and left the arena. They were surprised and disappointed. Helplessly, they could only look at the last arena that had not been decided yet. On the arena, a young scholar with a swollen face pushed a companion off the arena with difficulty. He looked around and found that other than him, there was only the fat man lying on the side of the arena. As long as he could drag the fat man off, he would be the winner. He walked to the fat man's side, grabbed his legs, and dragged him out with all his might. The fat man did not move an inch. His face turned red and he used more strength. Rip! The fat man's trousers were torn, and he fell off the arena with a piece of cloth in his hand. At this point, the 10 winners of the Wushu test had all been decided. In a hall somewhere in Hibiscus Garden, Li Xian looked around and said doubtfully, "Strange, where did Emingzi go?" Just as he finished speaking, a figure walked in from outside. Li Xian walked forward and said, "Where did you go? The last 10 people have been decided, we should go to the hall." "I was delayed by something." Emingzi tidied up her clothes and said, "Let's go. The Empress Dowager has arrived. The Imperial Concubine has arrived. His Majesty has arrived. The eldest princess has arrived. Princess Shining has arrived." In the hall, hearing the eunuch's sharp and thin voice, many of the officials and nobles bowed to pay their respects. "Dispense with the formalities." The Empress Dowager looked below and said, "Summon the 10 young talents into the hall." A trace of doubt appeared on Li Xian's face and he muttered, "It's already this time, that guy still hasn't appeared." Emingzi looked out of the hall, and then retracted her gaze and did not speak. Shining sat on her seat, and her body was straight. She looked out of the hall without blinking, and her hands were tightly holding onto the hem of her dress. Under the lead of a eunuch, 9 people walked into the hall. The reason why there were 9 people was because there was a fat man who was carried in. Li Xian's gaze swept across the faces of those people, and his face showed disappointment. Shaning's gaze immediately fell on the figure on the far left, and she could not look away. Chapter 1155. To be able to pass the theory examination and the first half of the combat examination, you are all outstanding talents of the younger generation in the Jing Kingdom. According to the usual practice, before the final segment, an official from the Ministry of Rites had to give a formal speech. Li Yi had never seen this official before. He scanned the crowd and saw many familiar faces, but there were even more new faces. He had been away for 5 years, and many officials had been promoted or demoted. The surrounding officials and nobles glanced at him and then back, but there were 2 gazes that were always on him. Those were 2 gazes in the same direction. After being in a high position for so long, Emingzi had a sense of supreme authority. This kind of authority was not present on the sloppy Li Xian. All the immaturity could no longer be seen on Shaning's face. She wore a palace dress and sat beside Emingzi. She had on light makeup, and her eyes were looking in this direction. Li Xian tilted his head and looked at Shining and Emingzi. He asked, "Why are you not anxious at all? Do you know something?" No one answered him. The official from the Ministry of Rites had reached the end of his speech. The first half of the combat examination has ended. For the second half, Princess Shining will test you personally. What had just happened was only the first half of the combat examination. Only by passing the first half would one have the chance to be tested by Princess Shining. The princess test was simple. The person who could defeat her would be the Emperor's son-in-law. If no one or more people won, the decision would be made by the Empress Dowager and the princess consort. Shining walked down from above, holding a sword in one hand. A young man walked into the hall from the crowd. He held a long knife and bowed to her respectfully. "Your Highness, please excuse me." Whispers could be heard among the officials. "He is a junior from the Zheng family. No wonder he could pass 2 rounds and stand here. The Zheng family has a genius in both literature and martial arts. I wonder if he can defeat Princess Shining. If he can marry Princess Shining, the Zheng family's rise will be imminent." As the officials whispered among themselves, the official from the Ministry of Rites struck the gong, signaling the start of the competition. The young man had already unsheathed his sword the moment the gong rang. Last year, during the military examination, he had lost to Princess Shining, who was disguised as a man, by 3 moves. In the past year, he had trained hard and his strength had improved greatly. He thought that he had a 50-50 chance of winning. Clang. He drew his sword very quickly, but Xiaoning was even faster. Halfway through pulling out his saber, a white shadow flashed in front of him. When he came back to his senses, a cold sword was already at his neck. Seeing this scene, a fatty who had just sat up from the ground took the opportunity to lie back down. Among the 9 of them, several of them couldn't help but shudder and take half a step back. I lost. The young man tilted his head and looked at the sword on his neck in disbelief. The officials were also stunned. From the looks of it, these people who had worked so hard to pass the written examination might not even be able to pass Princess Xiaoning's martial examination. This junior of the Zheng family was already a rare genius in both literature and martial arts. People like him couldn't possibly reach the pinnacle of both. As for him, he was already one of the most outstanding individuals among the 10. Xiaoning withdrew his sword and simply threw it on the ground, saying, "Next." The official from the Ministry of Rites immediately said, "Next, Peng Er." No one responded. A eunuch walked over to take a look and said, "Peng Er has fainted." Fainted people naturally couldn't compete with the princess and were treated as forfeiting. The official from the Ministry of Rites crossed off Peng Er's name and said, "Next." "I forfeit." A young man said hurriedly, "I am not a match for the princess, I forfeit." Many of the people present shook their heads. It was fine if he was not a match, but if he didn't even have the courage to fight, it would be too cowardly. This time, it wasn't just for Princess Xiaoning's consort. The officials of the court also wanted to see if there was someone with both ability and virtue among these people, so that they could guide them in the future. Clearly, this young man's forfeit had disappointed those who had their eyes on him. Up above, the Empress Dowager shook her head when she saw that only 2 people were left after Xiaoning eliminated them. This child should have passed the martial examination first and then the written examination. She and Emingzu have practiced martial arts for so many years. How could these young people be a match for her? Beside her, concubine Yin smiled and said, "That's not necessarily true." Watching those people being eliminated by Princess Xiaoning one after another, the official from the Ministry of Rites stood in the hall with a helpless expression and said, "Next, Mu Zi." Li Yi wasn't the last person. He didn't know how the list of competitors was arranged, but there was still one person behind him. Xiaoning thought about it and walked to the side of the official from the Ministry of Rites. She pointed to the last person and said, "I will compete with him first." The official from the Ministry of Rites was startled. "Your Highness, this. You can't do it, right? If you can't, then I won't compete." All right. The official didn't dare to say no. It wasn't difficult to change the order of the competition. If Her Highness didn't compete now, it would be a huge mistake for the Ministry of Rites. He would definitely be skinned by the minister afterwards. He looked at the name list again and said, "Next, Long Tao." The officials didn't know what Her Highness had said to the official from the Ministry of Rites. They felt it strange that the order of the competition was suddenly changed, but they didn't take it to heart. The last young man was a weak scholar. He looked at Xiaoning and said with a trembling voice, Please show mercy, Your Highness." "I won't hit you." Xiaoning thought about it and said, "Why don't you forfeit?" The young man's expression became solemn. He said, "A man should face difficulties head-on and not retreat. Even if I'm not a match for Your Highness, I will still try." The eyes of the surrounding people brightened slightly. "You have some courage. You know you can't win, but you still do it. Not bad. Even if you lose, you are so much stronger than the previous few." Xiaoning looked at him and nodded. She picked up the long sword that she had put down after the first round and said, "Then make your move. In order to respect you, I won't show mercy." The young man thought of the people who had been eliminated, and then looked at the sword she picked up. His heart trembled. In the next moment, a look of determination appeared on his face, and he strode forward to meet them. So what if he failed? Retreating because of fear was more shameful than failure. Thump. He suddenly sprained his ankle and fell to the ground. He held his ankle, cold sweat dripping from his forehead. My ankle is sprained." Contestant number 9 was carried off for treatment because he had accidentally sprained his ankle. When he was carried off, he looked disappointed, as if he would not have retreated if he had not sprained his ankle. At this point, among the 10 people, only Muzi was left. Of course, this did not mean that he was the emperor's son-in-law. If he had not passed Princess Shanning's test like the previous people, he would have ended up the same as the previous people. The people who had been eliminated could not help but look at him. As long as he lost, they still had a chance. The official from the Ministry of Rites cleared his throat and said, "Next, Muzi." Li took a few steps forward and stood in the middle of the hall. He looked at the woman opposite him. Shanning was also looking at him. Her expression was a little absent-minded as she stood there in a daze. She just looked at him. After a long time, the official walked to Shanning and cleared his throat. He whispered, "Princess, the competition has begun." Shanning looked away and nodded. He gripped his long sword and strode into the hall. She suddenly sprained her ankle. Her body swayed and the long sword in her hand fell to the ground. "Sprained my ankle." She steadied herself and limped to Li Yi's side. She raised her head, her eyes filled with tears. "I admit defeat." Chapter 1156. There was a moment of silence in the hall. Then whispers could be heard. Some people even looked at the ground in front of them. They thought that the Ministry of Rites was too careless. How could they be responsible for the venue? If His Majesty, the Empress, or the Empress Dowager were injured, they would not be able to absolve themselves from the blame. Then they were envious of the young man named Muzi. He was so lucky. Princess Shanning had defeated everyone except him. She had injured her ankle and lost without a fight. He had won so easily that it gave them a serious illusion. It did not look like he was going to marry the princess. Instead, it looked like Princess Shanning had overcome all the difficulties and obstacles to marry him. The jealousy of the people who were defeated by Princess Shanning could be felt even from a few feet away. Conspiracy. This was a blatant conspiracy. Why did they change the order of the competition when it was Muzi's turn? Princess Shanning's martial arts were so high, and this was a flat ground. How could she be so careless as to injure her ankle after taking 2 steps? Did they arrange everything before the competition? However, even though they knew there was something fishy going on, they did not dare to bring it up. The conspiracy was the royal family's conspiracy. Whoever dared to expose the royal family's conspiracy was obviously tired of living. Princess Shanning, who had sprained her ankle, was helped down by 2 palace maids. At this point, the selection of the emperor's son-in-law had been decided. The Empress Dowager and the Empress Dowager left first, followed by His Majesty and the eldest princess. When the officials finished sending them off and wanted to look for Muzi, they found that he had disappeared from the hall. Although the Empress Dowager, and His Majesty had left, the rest of the officials could still continue the banquet in the hall. Everyone gathered in 2s and 3s and whispered to each other, "This boy is a rare talent. If we train him carefully, he will become a good husband in a few decades. It's a pity to be the emperor's son-in-law." That's not true. His Majesty has always been unconventional in choosing people. I don't think he will care about this. This is definitely not his style of doing things. Li Xian paced back and forth in the hall as he spoke with absolute certainty. He looked at the eunuch at the side and said, "What about Muzi? Let him come and see me." The eunuch respectfully replied, "Replying to your Majesty, the son-in-law has been summoned by Consort Taifei." Li Xian thought for a moment and said, "Then let him come after the old princess finishes asking questions. The one with the surname Mu must have some relationship with Li Yi. He could use the throne as a wager. If he really had nothing to do with Li Yi, he could give the throne to Li Han or Emingzu." In another palace in Hibiscus Garden, concubine Yin looked at Shanning, who was being supported by 2 princesses, and looked back from time to time. She said, "All right, we're already here. There's no need to pretend." Shanning immediately let go of the palace maid who was supporting her and ran over to ask, "Imperial Mother, how did you know?" Concubine Yin looked at her and said, "Although I am old, I can still see." "How is Imperial Mother old?" Shanning hugged her arm and said, "Imperial Mother is not old at all." Concubine Yin shook her head and said, Even you have grown up and know how to get married. How can I not be old? Shanning suddenly blushed. She looked down at her toes and didn't dare to speak. Concubine Yin stroked her long hair and said, "All right, you go back to your room first. I have something to say to the son-in-law." Speaking of the word son-in-law, Shanning's face became even redder. She secretly looked back, and then left reluctantly. Li Yi followed Concubine Yin into a palace. Concubine Yin waved her hand and left. She looked back at Li Yi and said, "There are no outsiders here. Sit anywhere, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." Li Yi was startled and then cupped his hands and said, "Consort Taifei's eyes are like torches." He gently took off the mask on his face and sat down in the guest seat. Concubine Yin looked at him and didn't speak. Li Yi knew that she was waiting for his explanation. Before the former emperor died, he gave a secret edict. Li Yi looked at Concubine Yin and said, "Bingming's marriage should be decided by herself. No one can decide for her. This time, the search for the son-in-law is very popular. If the former emperor's edict was used, it would damage the royal family's reputation. So we had to do this, I know." Concubine Yin looked at him and nodded. She said, "Not only Jiang of Silla has this secret edict, but I also have it." Li Yi looked at her doubtfully and asked, "If that's the case, why did Consort Taifei? If I didn't do this, would Jiang of Silla come back?" Concubine Yan's question was too direct and undisguised. Li Yi opened his mouth but didn't say anything in the end. The former emperor did have such an edict. Concubine Yin looked at him and said slowly, "But that's not the reason why I want you to come back and stand here." Concubine Yan's tone was very calm, but every word made Li Yi's heart tremble. "Bingming is my biological daughter. I only have one daughter. I watched her grow up day by day. I watched her learn to walk, learn to speak, and grow to the age of 18. Girls' hearts are always open to the outside world. It has been like this since ancient times. When they grow up, they can't be kept." She said these words and looked at Li Yi again. She said calmly, "She is already 18 years old. From the time she was 14 years old, she was no longer a child. I can treat her as a child, but you can't. You've already abandoned her once. Don't abandon her a second time. Your Highness Jiang of Silla, do you understand what I mean?" Her expression was calm and her eyes were indifferent, but every word seemed to be sharp. Li Yi looked at her and nodded. He glanced at the table out of the corner of his eye. There was a book there. Mandarin Duck Handkerchief. This Mandarin Duck Handkerchief was thicker than any of the books collected by Mississippi Liu, by Su and Xiao Huan. "Sir, what did Mother say to you just now?" In Hibiscus Garden, Li Yi and Shanning were walking side by side. She had changed her clothes so that she didn't look so grand. She also let down her hair and walked quietly beside him. In the past, when they walked together, she would walk around him or lower her head and kick her feet. This time, she just walked side by side with Li Yi. Just as Concubine Yin said, no one could treat her as a child anymore. Li Yi didn't answer her question. He tilted his head and looked at her. He asked, "That Mandarin Duck Handkerchief was written by the old princess?" Shanning nodded. Li Yi thought that he actually met the old princess today. It turned out that the woman whom Xiao Huan and the others regarded as their life mentor was Shanning's mother, the former Concubine Yan, and now the old princess. "Sir." Shanning suddenly stopped, turned around, and raised her head to look at him. Li Yi also stopped in his tracks and looked into her eyes. She took a deep breath and said, "This is the last time I call you sir." She slowly reached out her hand and smiled. "I am Li Bingming. Nice to meet you." Li Yi thought for a moment. He reached out and held her small hand. He said, "Li Yi, nice to meet you." She held his hand tightly and said, "Li Yi, you passed the test and defeated me. Now you are my son-in-law." A eunuch ran from behind and said, "Son-in-law, His Majesty asks for you." Li Yi turned around and looked at him. He said, "Go back and tell him that I don't have time." Chapter 1157. How dare you? The eunuch didn't expect the new emperor's son-in-law to be so daring to disobey His Majesty's orders and speak such arrogant words. His expression immediately darkened. However, when he raised his head and saw the face of the person beside the princess, his entire body trembled. He fell to his knees and said in a trembling voice, I have eyes but failed to recognize Mount Tai. I mistook His Highness Jiang of Silla as the Emperor's son-in-law. Please forgive me, Your Highness. Get up. Li Yi naturally wouldn't make things difficult for a eunuch. He waved his hand and said, Go tell His Majesty that I'll visit him later. Yes, Your Majesty. The eunuch immediately got up and ran in the direction he came from. So what if he was the Emperor's son-in-law? To His Majesty, Jiang of Silla was much more important. In the Hall of Diligent Government, Li Xian suddenly slammed the table and said with a frown, What? Come find us later? How dare he? He isn't even the Emperor's son-in-law, yet he dares. He suddenly paused and turned his head to ask, Who did you say? Your Majesty, I didn't find the Emperor's son-in-law, but I saw Jiang of Silla. Jiang of Silla said that he'll visit you later. Jiang of Silla? Li Xian was surprised and pleasantly surprised. When did Jiang of Silla return? Where is he now? The eunuch immediately replied, He's with Princess Shaning in the direction of Hibiscus Garden. Li Xian had already stepped out of the door when a young girl ran over and asked, Imperial Father, where's little aunt's son-in-law? Don't worry about little aunt's son-in-law for now. Li Xian squatted down and looked at her. Xiaorui, do you miss Dwainer? Imperial Father will take you to see Dwainer later, okay? Dwainer is back. The little girl's face was full of excitement. She pulled Li Xian's arm and said, Why do we have to wait for a while? Let's go now. After she finished speaking, she seemed to have thought of something. She shook her head and said, I can't go now. As she ran back, she turned around and said, Father, wait for me. Wait for me to go back and change into some beautiful clothes. When she saw Dwainer, she was going to bring Dwainer to see that rascal who bullied her. Wasn't it just a competition to see who could jump higher? Dwainer would definitely be better than that rascal. Li Yi and Shaning parted at the gate of Furong Garden. He didn't need to look for Li Xian. He would definitely see him at the Li family today. He didn't return home. Instead, he left Hibiscus Garden and headed straight for the Imperial Palace. Because he was delayed by the combat examination today, he had yet to make his daily egg-fried rice. Imperial Palace. After watching the competition, Emingzu went straight back to the Hall of Morning Dew. The Ministry of Rites had submitted many reports regarding the selection of the Emperor's son-in-law. Recently, the Qi Kingdom, the Wu Kingdom, and even the Zhao Kingdom had made many moves. The situation was constantly changing. Although she had delegated most of the political affairs to her subordinates, she still had to handle some matters personally. A palace maid walked in and said, Your Highness, it's time to eat. After the new emperor of the Qi Kingdom ascended to the throne, he spent a long time stabilizing the domestic situation. Now that the domestic situation had stabilized, there were other movements. Zhao Yi was a very talented person. If he became the emperor of the Qi Kingdom, it would not be good for the Jing Kingdom. She was thinking about the meaning of some of the actions of the Qi Kingdom. Without raising her head, she said, Put it aside for now. What are you talking about? You can read the booklet later. The food will get cold soon. The booklet in her hand was taken away and replaced with a bowl of fragrant egg-fried rice. Li Yi leaned on the table and looked down at her. He asked, You've been eating it every day for the past few days. Aren't you tired of it? Emingzu picked up the spoon and asked, Aren't you tired of looking at Rui every day? It was not a question of whether she was tired of it. It was a question of whether she dared to be tired of it. Li Yi looked at her and asked tentatively, Did Rui come to find you? Emingzu took small bites of the egg-fried rice and nodded. She didn't do anything to you, did she? Li Yi was a little nervous. Emingzu looked up at him and asked, What could she do to me? Li Yi did not know how to answer this question. Emingzu and Rui had been fighting for so many years. She had to compete with Rui on everything. Who was better at martial arts, who had bigger breasts, who was first and who was last. Ever since Rui broke through to the master stage, she had lost her whole life. But he could not say it out loud. Otherwise, he would be adding fuel to the fire and deliberately hurt her. In order to change the topic, he picked up the booklet that she had been reading. He looked at it and murmured, Unusual movements at the border of Qi and Zhao. Zhao Yi wants to attack the Zhao Kingdom first. They are all from the Zhao family. Why do they have to do this? The Qi kingdom wants to attack the Zhao kingdom. Emingzu looked up at him and asked, why? Although the Zhao kingdom was not a vassal of the Qi kingdom, it had been following the lead of the Qi kingdom for more than 10 years. A few years ago, the two countries even joined forces to attack the Jing kingdom. Why would the Qi kingdom attack the Zhao kingdom? Li Yi said. Because Zhao Yi wants to be the ruler of the world. He can't defeat the Jing kingdom or the Wu kingdom, so he can only pick the weak ones to bully. How do you know? He told me. Li Yi thought for a while and suddenly looked at Emingzu. He asked, the ruler of the world, do you want to try? If you want, I can talk to Zhao Yi and ask him to surrender. If he can't be the empress of the Jing kingdom, he can be the empress of this world. Zhao Yi wanted to be the ruler of the world, but it did not matter who the ruler was. If what he said was true, then even Li Yi could not catch up to his strange hobby. Emingzu looked at him and asked, don't you already have an empress? Why? Isn't one enough? Li Yi was slightly stunned. When did I have an empress? She took out the booklet at the bottom and handed it to him. She said, this booklet was sent here urgently this morning. Li Yi opened the booklet and looked at it. On the 10th day of the 10th month in the 8th year of Warren, Princess Duanrong led a volunteer army of 300,000 and attacked the imperial city of the Wu kingdom. At that time, thunder rumbled in the sky. Within a radius of 10 miles, people and animals panicked. It was said that Princess Duanrong was blessed by the mandate of heaven and had the help of the god of heaven sent by the emperor. On the morning of the 11th day of the 10th month, the imperial city was breached. When Princess Duanrong entered the city, the people of the imperial city greeted her on the streets. The Emperor Wu was captured by the imperial army in the palace. The moment the city was breached, he committed suicide in the palace with a dagger hidden in his sleeve. Although Li Yi paid attention to the news of the Wu kingdom at all times, in terms of speed of transmission, it was still not as fast as the imperial court. Yang Liuqing finally completed her path to empress. Li Yi had seen all the difficulties and obstacles along the way, and a smile appeared on his face. Seeing that Emingzu was looking at him, he hurriedly put away the smile on his face. He explained, she is not my empress. You know, she is Rui's disciple, my martial niece. She only wanted to avenge her parents. The empress thing was just something that happened along the way. Emingzu finished eating the egg fried rice and put down the spoon. She looked at him and asked, if she is not, then am I? You are not an empress yet. I am tired. Emingzu stood up and said, I don't want to be an empress and I don't want to be an assistant princess. Li Yi asked in surprise. Then what do you want to do? She looked at Li Yi and suddenly asked, do you still have the thing that I gave you? Li Yi reached into his chest and took out a brocade bag. Emingzu took the brocade bag that was still warm and opened it. Inside was a lock of hair. She looked at Li Yi and asked, do you still remember what you said to me before? I remember. Li Yi nodded and said, I said, if you are tired of this kind of life, you can come and find me. There is one more thing. Emingzu looked at him and slowly said, Emingzu, I have good news. She looked at Li Yi and her lips moved. Li Xian's voice came from outside. She returned the brocade bag to Li Yi. Li Xian strode in and saw Li Yi. He said in surprise, you are actually here. When they were about to reach the Li Xian mansion, the little girl next to Li Yi couldn't help it anymore. She asked in a low voice, Uncle Li, is Dwainer back? Li Yi nodded with a smile and said, he's back. He has been clamoring to see you all day. The little girl's face showed a happy expression. She ran a few steps and then stopped. She slowed down her pace and showed a reserved expression. As soon as they stepped into the courtyard, Li Duan ran out of the room and asked, Father, can I see Xiao Rui now? Li Yi looked at the little girl next to him and said, What, you don't even recognize Xiao Rui? The two children looked at each other at the same time. The feelings between children were always the purest, but they often didn't know how to express it. Li Duan had been clamoring to see Xiao Rui all day, but when he actually saw her, he was so happy that he couldn't even speak. He was so happy that his face turned pale and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Chapter 1158. Li Xian always appeared when he was least supposed to. For the sake of Xiao Rui, Li didn't argue with him for the time being. Xiao Rui and Li Duan hadn't seen each other for more than 5 years. She was so excited that she couldn't speak. Li Yi and Li Xian walked into the room, giving them some time to be alone. So that Mu Zi is you. Li Xian looked him up and down and said, Mu Zi Li, no wonder Shanning lost to you on purpose. Why didn't I think of that at that time? Li Xian had enough IQ, but he was extremely lacking in EQ. A person who was always thinking of pushing the throne to someone else was definitely not normal. Li Xian had a look of disdain. I didn't expect you to be such a beast. You even had ideas about Shanning. Tell me honestly, did you have ideas about her the first time you saw her? If I remember correctly, she was only 11 years old at that time. The first time Li Yi saw Shanning was in the 2nd year of Jinghe. At that time, she was still at Sundara. At that time, he didn't even have ideas about Emingsu. At that time he wasn't so beastly. Even now, the 18-year-old Shanning was just a big kid in his eyes. She was different from Emingsu and the others. Li Yi cracked his knuckles and said, Do you believe that I won't even have ideas about you when I'm beastly? Li Xian knew that no matter how beastly Li Yi was, he wouldn't have ideas about him. But when he was beastly, he would hit him. He looked around and changed the topic. Miss Lu and the others haven't come back? Li Yi shook his head. No. Li Xian thought for a moment and asked, So you'll leave again? Li Yi thought for a moment and said, I'll leave after the new year. What about Shanning? Take her away. What about Emingsu? Take her away too. If you all leave, what about me? Li Xian had just sat down when he suddenly stood up and asked, If you take Emingsu away, what about the imperial court and the Jing kingdom? When Li Xian said this, he sounded very righteous and confident. When he was completely shameless, Li Yi actually had nothing to say in response. Li Yi sighed and said, You can still pass the throne to Li Han. Li Xian also let out a long sigh and said, Little Han has become smarter these past few years. It's not easy to trick him anymore. Emingsu will not leave. He looked at Li Yi and said, You won't leave her here alone. Why don't you return to the capital? If anyone dares to object, I'll chop off his head. What did he mean by Mingzhu wouldn't leave? If he hadn't appeared at the wrong time and interrupted Mingzhu, who knew what would have happened? The capital is too small. Li looked at him and said, Only when you leave the capital, leave the Jing kingdom, will you know how big this world really is. Seeing the strange light flashing in Li Xian's eyes again, Li knew that he shouldn't have said this. It was fine to abduct the princess, but abducting the emperor would cause him to be condemned and reviled by thousands of people. However, he would not stay in the capital for long. If he stayed here for too long, he wouldn't be able to find Rui. Li Xian looked at him, thought for a moment, and suddenly asked, Your little martial nephew is about to sit on the throne of the Wu kingdom. Don't you want to have 2 empresses? Li Xian's suggestion was very tempting, but his motive was not pure. Yang Liuqing became the empress for a better future of the Wu kingdom. Emingzu became the secret empress of the Jing kingdom because Li Xian couldn't help her. What did he mean by having 2 empresses? Did it have anything to do with him? In the room, both of them became silent. Everyone had a side that was not known to others. Some people looked beautiful on the surface, but secretly looked at Peppa Pig. Li Xian was actually very pitiful. On the surface, he was the emperor of the Jing kingdom, above thousands of people, and the most powerful man on this continent. However, what he was interested in was not the throne, nor was it power. From the beginning, there were only 2 stones of different sizes. Outside the room, in the yard, Li Duan covered his ears and said hurriedly, Xiao Rui, I was wrong. The little girl put one hand on her waist and pulled his ear with the other hand. She said angrily, What did you do wrong? Li Duan said softly, I was wrong that I didn't recognize you that day. The little girl originally thought that he was going to talk about how he used those words to anger her that day. Hearing him say that, her grip became even lighter. She said in a low voice, Then I also didn't recognize you. It's my fault. Li Duan said hurriedly, It's been too long. I've grown up. Of course you can't recognize me. You're not wrong, it's all my fault. But you still can't bully girls. I didn't know it was you at that time. I will never bully you. The little girl's hand changed from pinching to caressing. She asked softly, Does it hurt? Li Duan shook his head and said with a silly smile, It doesn't hurt. It really didn't hurt. It was much lighter than when his aunt spanked his butt. The relationship between Li Duan and Xiao Rui was established when the two of them could not crawl. It had not been diluted by the passage of time. When Li walked out of the room, the two of them were chatting and laughing as they played on the swing. Without disturbing them, he walked out of the estate and headed in the direction of the imperial palace. He had been interrupted by Li Xian earlier, so he and Emingzu had not finished talking. He was also very curious about what else he had said to her that time when he was drunk. Morning Dew Palace. Emingzu took off her phoenix coronet and changed into casual clothes. She said, Come take a walk with me. Ever since Li Xian had moved into Hibiscus Garden, the already spacious imperial palace had become much emptier. There were no guards in the enormous imperial garden. It was already winter, but the capital always snowed late. In the imperial garden, fallen leaves covered the ground, making it bleak and desolate. After a moment of silence, Li turned his head to look at her and asked, What was that last sentence? Mingzhu's footsteps paused. She pointed to an empty space in front of them and said, Beat me, and I'll tell you. A few years ago, of course, Li would not have agreed to this request of hers. But now it was different. Although Emingzu had not stagnated in the past few years, he had made much faster progress. He could not beat Rui or a grandmaster, but Emingzu. He was no longer the Jiang of Silla that she could bully at will. Li smiled and nodded. Okay. Li did not seem to practice diligently, but the tortoise breathing skill that he had learned from second great uncle was practiced 24 hours a day. The grandmasters around him were Rui Chang, Su, and Elder Tian. From time to time he would also communicate with second great uncle. In this life he would never be able to make a comeback under Rui. But Emingzu, when they first met, he was chased by her. Later he was suppressed by her. Today, it was finally time for him to fight back. After Jiang of Silla and the princess entered the imperial garden, it became a forbidden area. Emingzu walked to the empty space first. She took off her coat and put it aside. For the first time Li realized that he was not the person he was 5 years ago. Emingzu was also not the Emingzu of 5 years ago. She just hadn't met her fated chance. When she became a grandmaster, Rui and her would have to compete to know who would win. While he was distracted, a strong wind came from the front. Li moved his body and raised his palm to meet it. 2 hours later, Li Yi's clothes were all soaked, but he won after all. He pressed Emingzu on his lap and panted slightly. He asked, Do you surrender? Mingzhu's hair stuck to her face. She looked a little embarrassed. She said with a red face, Let me go. You even wrote a letter to Rui to beat me. Li looked at her and sneered. When you asked her to spank me, did you ever think that you would have this day? She struggled for a while, but Li had sealed her acupoints. She couldn't exert any strength at all. Li slapped a certain part of her body and said, In the martial world, there are some debts that must be paid. Rui hit me 18 times that time. I remember every one of them. At that time, I thought that one day, I will pay you back 18 times, one by one. This was a once-in-a-blue-moon opportunity, and he might not come across it again in the future. Li Yi's slap landed, and his face revealed an expression of revenge. Emingzu lay on his lap. After a moment of silence, she said, You said that if I got tired of this life, I would go to you and you would marry me. Li couldn't slap her anymore. Really? He looked at her with some suspicion. He had guessed it right. She wanted to cheat him into marrying her when he was drunk and didn't remember what had happened. It's fake. She struggled to get up and looked at Li. She asked, If it's fake, will you still marry me? Li thought for a moment and said, Yes. After saying the word yes, he was stunned for a moment. Maybe for 2 seconds. Then he quickly got up from the ground and ran outside. Chapter 1159. The world is really unfair. Li sensed the malice from the chance. He taught Tai Chi to Rui, and Rui became a guru. He kissed Mississippi Liu, and Rui also became a guru. He could understand these two ways of breaking through. Rui had accumulated a lot of experience, and she was enlightened because of Taiji. Rui had been thinking about him for a long time, and now that she had gotten what she wanted, it was not difficult for her to figure it out. But what happened to Emingzu? I only spanked her 10 times. Why did she also become a guru? Did I accidentally open up her conception and governing vessels, and let her become a guru in an instant? Maybe he could ask Lu Luo to put up more advertisements in the martial arts world. I have rich experience in assisting, and I am a professional in giving chances to help people become guru. Only available to women, and 20% off for group purchases. For more information, please go to Rui City. The address is... He had just taught Mingzhu the principle that he had to pay for what he had done. Now Mingzhu was teaching him the truth again. When Li Yi faced a grandmaster, it was not that he could not fight back. But Rui and Mingzhu had been stuck at a critical point for many years. All they needed was a kiss and a few pats, pats, pats. So once they made the breakthrough, they could already suppress ordinary gurus. Of course, it was like playing with him. Now she was lying on top of him. To be exact, she was riding on top of him. Run. Why don't you run? Mingzhu looked down at him from above, and said expressionlessly, just like 5 years ago, you can run. Li Yi sighed and grabbed her hand. With a little force, she lay on the grass with him. A long time ago, when the academy was just built, the two of them used to lie on the grass by the lake for 2 hours. Of course, at that time, they lay separately. No. Li Yi put his arm around her shoulder and said, I will take you with me. She lay on Li Yi's arm and suddenly asked, how far are you and Rui now? What do you mean? Did you hug her? Li Yi nodded. Did you kiss her? Li Yi nodded again. And then? Nothing. Li Yi shook his head. She turned her body, looked at him, and kissed him. Her lips parted on Li Yi's face and said, now we are the same. No. Li Yi shook his head and said she kissed on the lips. She hesitated for a moment. And this time, Li Yi felt a soft touch on his lips. However, time passed even faster, and before he could feel it, it had already disappeared. You even stuck out your tongue. This time, Li Yi didn't wait for her to kiss him and took the initiative to kiss her. 2 hours. What were you two doing inside? Li Xian stood outside the imperial garden for 2 hours. His feet were numb. He knew that Li Yi and Mingzhu had gone inside, so he did not go in to disturb them. However, he did not expect that they did not go in for a walk. They actually stayed inside for 2 hours. Mingzhu, who always paid attention to her appearance, had messy hair. Li Yi was even more embarrassed. Even his clothes were torn, and there were a few strands of grass in his hair. These evidence were enough to prove that they had just had an intense and long exercise on the grass. This was a bit too long. Li Yi had seen Li Xian 3 times today. Fortunately, he finally had some vision for the last time, and did not directly barge in like he did in the morning. He looked at Li Yi and Mingzhu and said solemnly, I have something important to tell you too. When the usually frivolous Li Xian spoke to them with such an expression, it meant that he really had something important to tell them. Mingzhu nodded and said, let's go back and talk. Morning Dew Hall. Li Xian looked at the two solemnly and asked, you two are leaving? Mingzhu looked at him and then nodded. Li Xian let out a long sigh and said, I don't want to be the emperor. Li Xian had never wanted to be the emperor. So Li Yi and Mingzhu both looked at him and waited for his explanation. You both know that I am not cut out to be the emperor. Li Xian looked at them and said, Mingzhu has left. I can't handle the matters of the court. Li Yi nodded and said, we know. Li Xian sighed and said, I know that Mingzhu has her own life and her own happiness. I don't have the power, and I don't want to hold her back. But I don't want to be the emperor. Actually, being the emperor isn't that difficult. Below the emperor, there are still the prime minister and all the civil and military officials in the court. You don't have to decide everything, big or small. Li Yi looked at him and said, you might as well hurry up and have a son with the empress and imperial concubine. When he grows up, you can pass the throne to him. Since ancient times, when the situation of a country stabilized, the emperor could be a mascot. As long as he didn't make any big mistakes, he only needed to supervise the officials, and the country would continue to run smoothly. Speaking of this matter, the expression on Li Xian's face became even more sorrowful. He had already given birth to 3 children, 2 for the empress and 1 for imperial concubine. But all 3 of them were daughters. Perhaps he really didn't have the same fate as Li Yi. I might not be able to make it. If Qin Er's pregnancy this time is a daughter. He suddenly looked up at Li Yi and Mingzhu and said, "Why don't you try?" They definitely wanted to try, but although his and Mingzhu's future child would have the surname Li, he wouldn't be able to inherit the throne of the Jing kingdom. Li Xian's plan as Rui would be in vain. Speaking of which, it was difficult to break through to Grandmaster, but it was even more difficult for a Grandmaster to get pregnant. Now that Rui and Mingzhu had both become Grandmasters, if they wanted to have children in the future, they would have to go through the same hardships that he and Rui had gone through in the past. Li Yi didn't think it was impossible. A lifetime was long, and hard work paid off. As long as he changed a few positions and tried a few more times, he would succeed one day. He didn't know if his situation would be better if he became a Grandmaster. Apart from other things, at least his waist wouldn't be so weak anymore. Before Li Yi and Mingzhu could answer, Li Xian shook his head and said, "No, even if you can give birth, it will be more than 10 years later. I can't wait that long." Li Yi looked at him for a long time and said, "There are so many princes in the Li family. You can just pass the throne to one of them." Li Xian looked at him and said, "Do you think I'm stupid? If I really pass the throne to someone else, do you think we can still live?" It seemed that he wasn't as stupid as he thought. Li Yi looked at him and said, "Just accept your fate. Only you being the emperor is the best. Anyone who wants to be the emperor will not have a good ending." Li Xian seemed to understand something. He looked at him and asked, "You mean, only those who don't want to be the emperor are the most suitable?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "I didn't say anything. There are countless princes who want to be the emperor. The only ones who don't want to be the emperor are probably you and Xiaohan." In the Mathematics Institute, Li Han, who had just solved a difficult mathematical problem, was different from usual. He didn't feel excited at all. Instead, he felt an inexplicable annoyance. A beautiful girl walked in and said with a smile, "Brother Han, I cooked lotus seed porridge. Try it while it's hot." Li Han felt even more bitter when he saw the beautiful girl, but he still squeezed out a smile and said, "Thank you, Sister Wang." Chapter 1160. "Sir, how do you solve this question?" Li Han asked him with a question. Li Yi glanced at it and felt it was strange. Although this question required a lot of twists and turns, with his ability, he could solve even more difficult questions. It was strange that he couldn't solve this one. However, everyone had a blind spot in their thinking. This was normal. When Li Yi picked up the pen and was about to tell him, Li Han asked casually, "Sir, is Duanwu not at home?" She took Duaner and Xiao Rui outside to play. Li Yi didn't raise his head. "Why are you looking for her?" "Nothing." Li Han shook his head and suddenly said, "Sir, I suddenly understand how to solve this question. I'll solve it myself first. I'll come back tomorrow to show you." Li Yi put down the pen and looked at him. "Duanwu is not at home tomorrow either." "Then after Li Han realized something was wrong as soon as he opened his mouth. He immediately said, "I just have something to talk to her about. I still have some doubts about mathematics. I'll come back in a few days to ask, sir." Li Yi drank some water and asked, "You're not wondering about mathematics, but why Duanwu ignores you?" Li Han froze in place. After a moment he sighed and said, "A girl's mind is even harder than a mathematics question." Li Yi looked at him and asked, "If you want Duanwu to pay attention to you, you have to first tell me who the younger sister of the Wang family is?" Li Han sighed again and said, "Her name is Wang Ling." The Wang family and the royal family had always had a close relationship. 7 or 8 years ago, they had bet on the right treasure and married their first daughter to Li Xian, who was still the heir. Now that the heir's wife had become the empress, the Wang family had become the most famous family in the capital. Wang Ling, was Wang Qin's younger sister. Her engagement to Li Han was even before Li Xian and Wang Qin. Li Yi didn't know if the Wang family was betting everywhere, or if the Wang family's master's eyes were really extraordinary. He only found out after asking Li Han that it was the latter. The Wang family only had 2 daughters. One was married to Li Xian. One had been betrothed to Li Han since she was young. Wang Linger and Li Han were childhood friends. Speaking of which, the Dragon Boat Festival only appeared later. Unfortunately, there were some things that didn't care about first come, first served. There was no way to reason this out. Is there no way to make a girl not be jealous? Li Han looked at him and asked for help. Sir, what should I do? In his eyes, the teacher could teach him more than just arithmetic. He had so many mistresses. If he had a tenth of his teacher's ability, he wouldn't have made things like this. It was a woman's nature to be jealous. A woman who wasn't jealous wasn't a woman. Even when Wanru and Rui would get jealous for no reason. Not to mention the jealous Rui. If he knew how to stop a girl from getting jealous, he wouldn't have been beaten up so badly by her in the past. Li Han was just left out. Back then, he risked his life every single time. Living under the threat of autumn water, living in fear. Li looked at him and asked, "Tell me the truth. Do you like that sister from the Wang family?" Li Han pondered for a long time before saying, "Ever since she was young, she always followed behind me in everything. I treated her like a younger sister. I would beat up anyone who bullied her. At that time, Lady Mother told me that she would be my consort. We promised when we were young that I would marry her when I grew up." Li continued to ask, "Do you like her?" "I like the Dragon Boat Festival." Li Han looked up at him and said, "But I can't hurt the sister from the Wang family. She trusts me the most. Sir, I really don't know what to do." Relationships were complicated. Li could teach him arithmetic, but he couldn't teach him these things. Should he break the engagement with the Wang family and choose to be alone for the rest of his life? He could live a carefree life with the Dragon Boat Festival and leave the Wang family's childhood sweetheart alone until she grew old, or marry someone else and live a depressed life, or he could keep his promise and give up on the Dragon Boat Festival and complete the engagement with the Wang family. Or there were other choices. These were all decisions that Li Han had to make himself. Even if Dragon Boat Festival was his sister, he wouldn't give Li Han any guidance on this matter. Li Han left. Before he left, he didn't get any answers from Li Yi. Li Yi picked up the teacup and found that there was no water left in the cup. A figure came out from the back of the hall and refilled his cup. Li Yi looked at Dragon Boat Festival and asked softly, "Do you blame me?" He could tell Li Han that he didn't care about the engagement. A good man was the one who courageously pursued true love. He was Dragon Boat Festival's brother, so he naturally had to think for her first. If it was 7 or 10 years ago, before he came to this world, when he first came to this world, he would have told Li Han to pursue free love. This was what a young man should do. However, he wouldn't do that now. This wasn't the modern world after all. There were rules here. Maybe Dragon Boat Festival would be sad because of Li Han's choice. Maybe the other girl's hair would turn white overnight because of him. However, these were all his choices. The girl shook her head and said, "Actually, they met first. Brother, am I too jealous? I ignored Li Han because I wanted him to leave Wang Linger. Am I very bad? There is no order in this matter, and there is no right or wrong." Li Yi stood up and patted her shoulder. He said, "I believe that you will handle everything well." The Mathematics College and the Women's College were on vacation. When Li Yi and Shanning walked around the college, they could only see some servants. The teachers and students had already gone home. Xiao Han has locked himself in the Mathematics College for the past few days. He said that he wouldn't come out until he proved the theorem. He didn't want to see anyone. Shanning looked at a building in the distance and said worriedly, "I'm really worried that he will get sick from holding himself in." Li Han already knew that the theorem wasn't something he could prove in his lifetime. He was just avoiding it. He said that he wouldn't see anyone, but in fact, he just didn't dare to see 2 people. A beautiful girl came from the front and bowed to Shanning. She said, "Greetings, Sister Ning Er." Shanning looked at her and asked, "Ling Er, you went to see Xiao Han again?" The beautiful girl nodded and said, "Brother Han needs to use his brain every day. I cooked some lotus root and pork rib soup. It can nourish the blood, replenish the marrow, calm the nerves and strengthen the brain. Go." Shanning nodded and said, "He likes pork rib soup the most." She looked at Shanning and bowed to Li Yi before leaving. "Then I'll go first." Shanning sighed and said, "I just saw that Dragon Boat Festival had passed. I don't know what Xiaohan will do." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Let them worry about their own matters." Shanning looked at the pavilion in the middle of the lake in the distance and said, "I haven't gone fishing in a long time. Let's go fishing by the lake, okay?" Li Yi nodded. Shanning revealed a smile on her face. She subconsciously held onto Li Yi's hand and walked forward quickly. After 2 steps, she seemed to realize something and quickly let go of his arm. Her face once again revealed a reserved expression. Li Yi still liked to see her innocent and unaffected appearance. She didn't want to change herself for others and pretend to be reserved. Ning air. Li Yi looked at her and said, "You can do whatever you want in the future. Don't worry. No matter what you are, I like you." Her body trembled. She raised her head and looked at Li Yi. After a long time, the reserved expression on her face disappeared. She held onto his arm and happily said, "Then let's go fishing first. Then we'll go to the streets. I want to eat candy, people. I want to eat 10. At the entrance of a small building in the academy, the beautiful girl looked at the girl in front of her. Her face was slightly flustered. She quickly said, I only cooked some soup. I didn't know that Sister Dragon Boat Festival had also cooked. I'll go back first." Dragon Boat Festival looked at the girl who hurriedly turned around and was about to leave. Her face revealed a complicated expression. Pa. A crisp sound of porcelain breaking came from behind. The beautiful girl turned her head and saw that the soup bowl in Dragon Boat Festival's hand had fallen to the ground and shattered into pieces. "It's all my fault." Dragon Boat Festival walked over and looked at her. She said with some distress, "The soup has been poured away. We can only let him drink Sister Ling Er's soup. Let's go up together." Chapter 1161. Li Han's seclusion officially ended, not because he proved Goldbach's conjecture, but because Wang Linger gave him a bowl of soup during the Dragon Boat Festival. This bowl of lotus root and pork rib soup was not only good for the brain, but also for the body. After drinking the soup, he immediately came back to life. When he was grilling the fish, his movements became faster. This way the fish was more tender, more uniform, and more delicious. In the past few years, Li Han had been obsessed with mathematics and the Dragon Boat Festival, so he did not neglect his skills in grilling fish. The fish had just been caught by Shou Ning. The academy had protected this lake very well. The fish in the lake were delicious and naturally free of pollution. Whether it was steamed, boiled, stewed, or barbecued, they were all very good ingredients. Li Xian did not have such good fortune this time. He did not bother Li Yi for the past 2 days because the Empress was pregnant again. The due date was around the new year, so he had to stay by her side. Shanning fed Li Yi a piece of fresh fish and asked, "When are we going back to Ruri City? I haven't seen Xiaomu for a long time." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "After the new year." He did not know when they would come back after leaving the capital this time. The journey was long. Although the old lady was healthy, she had to plan the route well to minimize the bumpiness and fatigue. Moreover, before leaving, she had to see some old friends in the capital and say goodbye to some people. Shanning suddenly lowered her head. Her eyes were a little dim. She said, "I have asked my mother. She said she wants to stay in the capital and will not go with us." Concubine Yin was the wisest woman Li Yi had ever met. This kind of person was usually very assertive. Shanning wanted her to leave with them, but she refused, so there was no room for negotiation. Moreover, as the old imperial concubine, she could not leave the capital city as she pleased. Li Yi held her hand and said, "Don't worry. I will come back with you to see her every year." Shanning's eyes lit up again. She suddenly leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. Then, she blushed and lowered her head to work on the grilled fish in front of her. In the distance, Li Han was flipping the roasted fish. He withdrew his gaze and let out a long sigh. "Big brother Han, if you're tired, you should rest for a while." The beautiful girl walked over, took out a handkerchief, and gently wiped the sweat off his forehead. Li Han peeked at Duan Wu, who was standing at the side. When he saw that her face did not reveal any unusual expression, he was delighted and flipped the iron skewers in his hand even faster. The Jing kingdom had undoubtedly become the center of the world. The capital was becoming more and more prosperous, gathering merchants from various countries. Because of geographical factors, although the prosperity of the business in the capital could not be compared to Suzhou and Rui City, overall, it was already the largest city in the known surrounding countries. Here, one could eat the sugar figurines of the Jing kingdom, the Wu kingdom, the Qi kingdom. Li Yi could not tell the difference between these sugar figurines, but according to Shanning, each kind of sugar figurine tasted different. 18 years old was actually the time when a girl was in her prime and the most lively. She, who had regained her original nature, appeared more real, which was what Li Yi hoped to see. Some people did not need to mature and grow up. She could be a child for the rest of her life, as long as she was willing, as long as she was happy. Walking on the street, from time to time, she would stuff some snacks into his mouth. Li Mu would probably like Shanning very much. Her gluttony was similar to Zue Mo's. Every street in the capital was very noisy, but when the two of them walked to a certain place, they could still hear a clear conversation in front of them. "I've finally found you, Peng. It's time to settle the score between us. You black-hearted thing. How dare you sell us a fake test paper for 10 taels of silver? It's fine if you sell us the fake test paper, but you actually hid the real test paper and passed the written test alone." At the entrance of a restaurant, a few scholars in green who were supposed to be gentle and elegant were now punching and kicking a person on the ground with violent expressions. A woman looked panicked. She pulled the scholars in green and said repeatedly, "Stop beating him, stop beating him. How much money does he owe you? We'll pay you back, we'll pay you back." However, those people ignored her. They waved their hands impatiently, pushed her away, and said angrily, "You can't blame us for doing such a dirty thing even if you beat him to death. Young masters, please calm down, calm down." An old man walked out of the restaurant and hurriedly said, "A few days ago, there were countless people selling fake scrolls in the capital. He must have stolen a few copies. If you continue to fight like this, someone will die." Of course, those people also knew that this fatty was only one of the countless people who had stolen the test papers. However, the problem was that he clearly knew that there were real test papers, but he still used fake papers to deceive them. He overcame all the obstacles along the way, passed the written test and the martial test, and almost became the emperor's son-in-law. Thinking about how they worked hard to memorize the questions, only to find out that they did not get a single question right after they took the exam. They almost died suddenly in the exam, and after they came out, they were seriously ill for 3 days. This was intolerable. "Go away." One of them shook off the old man and kicked the person on the ground fiercely. He said angrily, he dared to sell fake test papers back then, he should have expected this day. After kicking him a few times, he still could not vent his anger. He picked up a long bench from a roadside stall and smashed it hard at him. In the end, the bench in his hand did not land on the person on the ground. A young man grabbed the bench in his hand and looked at him. He said, "It's wrong for him to sell fake test papers, but it's reasonable for you to buy fake test papers. You've hit him and you've scolded him. Enough is enough." The green-robed scholar saw that the other party was about the same age as him, but he acted like he was teaching someone a lesson. He felt even more indignant and said angrily, "Who do you think you are?" Smack. Li gave him a backhand slap. Although he did not use much strength, that person was still sent flying. He lost a few teeth and lay on the ground, unable to recover for a long time. The other companions next to that person were also stunned on the spot. It was the first time in their lives that they had seen someone sent flying with a slap. For a moment, they did not dare to rush forward. However, they moved and surrounded Li Yi and Shanning. One of them quickly ran into the distance. Li Yi looked at Shanning and asked, "Are you hungry?" Shanning nodded in embarrassment. Li Yi smiled and said, "Then let's go in and eat something. This restaurant used to taste pretty good. I wonder how it is now." The old man from the restaurant walked to his side and whispered, "Young master, you should leave quickly. You won't be able to leave in a while." One of the young men glared at the old man, and the old man immediately stopped talking. Li Yi looked at the fatty lying on the ground and said to the woman beside him, "You guys come in too." Although the woman did not know the person in front of her, he was definitely not a bad person since he had helped earlier. Seeing his outstanding temperament, she could not help but be influenced by him. She only hesitated for a moment before nodding. She helped the fatty on the ground up and walked in. The old man's expression changed slightly. He looked at a waiter behind him and said, "Quick, go and get the shopkeeper here." Inside the restaurant, although the fatty's face was bruised, he still struggled to get up. He cupped his hands at Li Yi and said, "Thank you for your help just now, brother." He looked at the young man in front of him and then at the woman beside him. He didn't know why, but he felt that he had seen this woman somewhere before. Even this brother of his felt that she was very familiar. "You don't recognize me now? Didn't you say that we were fated when you sold me the fake exam papers?" Li Yi looked at him and said with a strange expression. The fatty's expression changed when he heard this. He trembled and said, You. He was a little terrified. If the person in front of him had also bought his fake exam papers, could it be that he wanted to beat him up by asking him to come in? Li Yi looked at him and said with a smile, "If you hadn't cheated me of 5 coins, I would have kicked you a few times outside." You. Only one person had bought the fake exam papers from him for 5 coins. The fatty immediately remembered that this person was Mu Zi. However, they did not look alike at all. If he was Mu Zi, then he would be the emperor's son-in-law. Then wouldn't the woman beside him be? Ping Er turned his head to look again. He finally understood why he felt so familiar with the woman. He suddenly felt his legs turn to jelly, and he almost fell to the ground. The old man walked in from the back door of the restaurant and pointed in front of him, saying, "Shopkeeper, it's them." A middle-aged man walked in front of him. The man did not look old, but his hair was already white. There was another sturdy man beside him. When Li Yi looked over, he was slightly startled. Then he could not help but laugh. Chapter 1162. In the backyard of the restaurant. Qin He looked at Li Yi with a smile, cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, Jiang of Silla." Wu Er stood beside him and smiled honestly, looking a little embarrassed. Qin He looked to his side and said, "This is His Highness Jiang of Silla. Hurry up and greet him." 4 women stood beside him and said in unison, "Greetings, His Highness Jiang of Silla." Among the 4 women, Li Yi recognized one of them. She was Miss Lin of Silla, who had stirred up the entire capital with an unjust case several years ago, and caused the Chu family to go from prosperity to decline. He had never seen the others before. After the 4 of them greeted each other, they left. Qin He looked at him and explained, "The 3 of them are Qin Er's sisters." No matter how much he explained, he could not hide the fact that he was a beast. He might as well not be called Qin He and change his name to Beast. Li Yi looked at him and shook his head slightly, saying, "I haven't seen him for several years, but 5th Master has become such a beast." Qin He looked at Shanning, who was sitting beside Li Yi, and said with a smile, "Compared to Jiang of Silla, we are the same." They were all beasts, and beasts would always feel a sense of intimacy because they were of the same kind. Li Yi looked around and asked, "5th Master is not in Qin Manor. When did he become the shopkeeper of this restaurant?" "Qin Manor is too big, but there are not many people. I am not used to living here." Qin He smiled and said, "After father passed away, I sold Qin Manor and bought this restaurant. When I am free, I am a shopkeeper. It is not bad." Prime Minister Qin had already passed away a year ago. This old man had devoted his entire life to the Jing kingdom. In his later years, his family was ruined, and he only had one son by his side. The rise of the Qin family was caused by Prime Minister Qin, and it also ended with Prime Minister Qin. Fortunately, the last few years of his life were peaceful, unlike Grand Tutor Chu, who ended up being cursed by thousands of people 3 years ago. Grand Tutor Chu died of depression, and the Chu family became history. A generation of Grand Tutor Imperial Tutor had fallen to such a state. It was sad and lamentable. "Before my father passed away, he always wanted to see you." Qin He helped him refill his cup of tea and said, "In those years, Grand Tutor Chu was despised by everyone. People began to call my father the scholar's bone of Jing Kingdom." He said that he wasn't a scholar's bone, He was just a bag of old bones with a bit of a scholar's persistence. Qin He looked up at him and said, "He said that you are the bone of the Jing kingdom, the real bone. Before you appeared, there were no bones in the Jing kingdom, but now there are." Unfortunately, he can only see that after the Jing kingdom has a bone, he can only stand up and walk forward 1 step, 2 steps, but he can't see any further. Li looked at him and suddenly asked, "Don't you hate him?" "Hate? Of course I hate him." Qin He nodded and said, "He was a good prime minister, but not a good father. Otherwise, the Qin family wouldn't have fallen to such a state." But, as he spoke, he smiled and waved his hand, saying, "It's all in the past. Everything is fine now. People still have to look forward and not always look back." As for Qin He, Li couldn't give much of an evaluation. He was one of the few people he had met who understood. He admired and admired him. Perhaps it was because the two of them were both beasts in some aspects. Qin He drank a cup of tea and said, "This time, the Jiang of Silla returned to the capital, but there was no news from the capital at all. I really find it a bit strange." Li heard the meaning in his words. It was nothing more than every time he returned to the capital, he would cause a commotion in the capital, wanting everyone to know that he was back. This time he was a little too low-key. He smiled and put down the cup. He stood up and said, "There will be news soon." Crash. In the restaurant, a young official with half of his face swollen flipped over a table and said angrily, "Where is he? Come out." As he walked into the restaurant, more than 10 young people came in one after another. These people had outstanding temperament and were dressed luxuriously. At first glance, one could tell that they were not ordinary people. Behind them, a group of officials quickly came in. Peng Er sat on the innermost stool. Seeing this scene, his body trembled. These people were all the sons of famous officials in the capital. How could they be alarmed? He immediately whispered to the woman beside him, "Quick, go to the back and tell that brother not to come out." After saying that, he realized that the person who bought the fake test papers with 5 copper coins was not an ordinary person. That was the current emperor's son-in-law. Moreover, with Her Royal Highness by his side, what did he have to be afraid of? The ones who should be afraid were those people. At this time, Li and Shanning had already come out from the back. The official with the swollen face pointed at Li and said loudly, "That's him." A young man beside him looked at him and said with a frown, "You guys were beaten like this by him alone. Do you need to come to the county government to ask for help?" A man behind him smiled and said, "If I had known this would happen, I wouldn't have come to watch the show. What a waste of food and wine." As they talked, they didn't notice that behind them, several people's faces had changed dramatically. Their lips couldn't stop trembling, and they couldn't even stand steadily. Li turned to look at Qin He and said, "It's not easy to take advantage of you. Give me all your specialty dishes." Qin He looked at Wu Er and said, "Go and arrange it. You're about to die and you still want to eat." Half of the young official's face was swollen, and he couldn't speak clearly. He pointed at Li and said, "That's him." The young man beside him looked at the yamen runners behind him and said, "What are you waiting for? Take him back to the county government first." The guests in the restaurant had already run away when these people came in. Li and Shanning picked a table and sat down. The group of yamen runners came to them. Seeing that they were so calm, they didn't dare to act rashly. Seeing this, the young man who had just ordered them was about to get angry, but he was pulled by someone behind him. The man said in a trembling voice, That seems to be Jiang of Silla." "Jiang of Silla?" Hearing this, the young man was stunned. For a moment, he didn't remember that there was a Jiang of Silla in the capital city. The next moment, when he came to his senses, his legs began to weaken, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. It had only been 2 years since his father was transferred to the capital city, but he couldn't be more familiar with the legendary Jiang of Silla. This was a man who had once stirred up the entire capital city, the entire Jing kingdom, and affected the general trend of the world. His legs were weak, but he couldn't let them go. He forced himself to gather some strength, took 2 quick steps forward and shouted, "Stop!" Seeing that their young master had spoken, the group of yamen runners immediately retreated to the side. The young man took a deep breath, took 2 steps forward, bowed, and said in a trembling voice, Greetings, Jiang of Silla, His Highness Jiang of Silla. This is a misunderstanding. Thump. Someone's legs went weak. It wasn't the stuttering young man, but Peng Er. The person who sold the fake exam papers wasn't the emperor's son-in-law, but Jiang of Silla. No, it was the emperor's son-in-law. Jiang of Silla was the emperor's son-in-law. Jiang of Silla was the emperor's son-in-law. And the emperor's son-in-law was Jiang of Silla. He felt like he had discovered an incredible secret. Would he be silenced? Greetings, His Highness Jiang of Silla. Greetings, Your Highness. Seeing this, the dozen or so people also walked forward, trembling. Their faces were pale, and they all bowed to pay their respects. At this moment, their hearts were filled with regret. Why did they have to join in on the fun? The group of people almost surrounded the table. Li looked back at them and said, "Why are you all standing here? Do you want to sit down and eat?" Chapter 1163. Being invited to a meal by Jiang of Silla. In the entire capital, there were only a few people who had this kind of qualification. What these young people felt at this moment was naturally not that they were overwhelmed by the favor, but that they were terrified. They were extremely regretful in their hearts. Why did they have to join in the fun today? At this moment, they were in a dilemma, but they did not dare to block the way, and they all retreated to the corner. And the servants accompanying them hurriedly left. As for the young scholar with a swollen face, his face was already ashen, paralyzed on the ground, and even his lips could not move. Li looked back at the fatty and said, "Do you want to sit down and eat together?" "No need, no need." Peng Er hurriedly shook his head and said, "Thank you, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." Sitting at this table, one was Princess Shaning, and the other was His Highness Jiang of Silla. The matter of him selling fake test papers to His Highness Jiang of Silla was enough for him to brag for a lifetime. Eating at the same table with His Highness Jiang of Silla and Princess Shaning. What virtue or ability did he, Fatty Peng, have? Even the smoke on his ancestral grave did not dare to emit like this. Li no longer forced him. He looked at him and said, "You can be considered to have hands and feet. If you use your mouth to do business, you will definitely not lose money. In the future, it is better to do less of this kind of thing." The woman next to Peng Er knelt in front of Li Yi and hurriedly said, "Brother Peng sold fake test papers just to treat my seriously ill mother. Please forgive him this time, Your Highness. We will definitely return the money in the future." He was wrong to sell fake test papers, but those who intend to cheat are not righteous people. Li Yi waved his hand and said, "In the future it will be fine." Peng Er nodded and said, "I will definitely remember Your Highness Jiang of Silla's teachings." Li Yi looked at him and suddenly asked, "Are you interested in working at Jiang of Silla's residence?" He had had 2 brief encounters with Peng Er. Although his act of reselling fake exam papers seemed to be beneath him, the fact that he was able to stand out among all the fake exam dealers in the capital and successfully attract so much hatred showed that he still had a lot of redeeming qualities. After all, there were so many unscrupulous dealers in the capital who sold fake test papers, but he was the only one who was beaten on the street. This kind of person was born to do business. After they left this time, the Li family still needed a reliable person to take care of the business. This Peng Er would be of great use if he was properly trained. Peng Er was stunned at first, but after he realized it, he immediately knelt on the ground and said, "Li family of Li family, Your Highness Jiang Silla, Your Highness, Your Highness." Li Yi waved his hand and motioned for Peng Er to get up. A middle-aged man in official robes walked in from the door. He tidied up his clothes and said respectfully, "This lowly official is the capital's magistrate Linda. Greetings, Your Highness Jiang of Silla and Princess Shaning." When Li Yi left, the capital's magistrate was still Lu Dayo. Now that Lu Dayo had become the capital governor, this new magistrate was a new face. His face was a bit frightened as he said, "This lowly official was not strict enough and alarmed Your Highness. Please punish me." Li looked at this magistrate and asked, "Fighting in the street with no regard for human life, what about the law?" The middle-aged man looked at the young man with a swollen face and immediately said, "Your Highness, rest assured, this lowly official will investigate this case and punish it according to the law." Li looked at Shaning and asked, "Are you full?" Shanning nodded and said, I'm full. Li Yi stood up and looked at the magistrate and said, I'll leave this to Magistrate Lin. The magistrate immediately bowed and said, Your Highness, please rest assured. Li Yi waved at Qin He and said, Let's go. Send off Your Highness. The magistrate immediately bowed and said, Take care, Your Highness. Li Yi and Shanning walked out of the restaurant and parted ways with Pring Er and the woman. They walked towards the Jiang of Sila's residence. In this big capital, there were not many people who could talk to him nicely. Qin He was one of them. Although he lived like a beast, he was also free and easy. He immersed himself in his own world and didn't care about the outside world. He was a smart person who could see through the world. At the entrance of the restaurant, Wu Er looked in the direction Li Yi disappeared in before looking away. Wu Er scratched his head and murmured, His Highness seems different from before, but I can't tell what's different. Qin He smiled and said, In the past, His Highness Jiang of Silla was like a sharp sword, showing off its edge. The current His Highness is still a sword, just that he has hidden the edge of the sword. Wu Er scratched his head. Although he still didn't understand, he was used to Fifth Lord not speaking human language. When they walked into the restaurant, the magistrate walked up and said with a smile, I'll get someone to compensate for the restaurant's loss. There's no need for it to be doubled, just compensate at the original price. Qin He waved his hand and said, Thank you in advance, magistrate. The magistrate's heart skipped a beat. This restaurant manager and Jiang of Silla seemed to be familiar with each other. His background should not be small. A smile appeared on his face again and he said, Of course, of course. After walking out of the restaurant, most of the young masters heaved a sigh of relief. They wiped the cold sweat off their foreheads and felt like they had survived a disaster. One of them heaved a long sigh of relief and said, Fortunately, we didn't offend Jiang of Silla. It's said that a few years ago, when Jiang of Silla wasn't Jiang of Silla, many young masters of the top families in the capital city were dragged to the palace gates to be flogged because they offended him. They couldn't get out of bed for a few months. There was another time when more than 10 important officials of the imperial court had to personally go to a restaurant to retrieve their juniors. It could be said that they were completely humiliated. As the crowd heaved a sigh of relief, they looked at one person in the crowd and said gratefully, Thank you for reminding us just now, Brother Zheng. Otherwise, this would have led to a disaster. The young man they called Brother Zheng was still pale. He looked at them and said with a trembling voice, You think it's over? He wiped the sweat on his palms on his clothes. These people had not experienced some things, so how would they know the fear of the entire capital city being dominated by Jiang of Silla? This was not the end, but just the beginning. Jiang of Silla had returned. This capital city would probably experience another huge shock. In a certain official's mansion, an official who had just rushed home looked at his son and asked in horror, Did you have a conflict with Jiang of Silla just now? No conflict, no conflict. The young man immediately said, We just went to watch the show. We definitely didn't have a conflict with His Highness Jiang of Silla. Watch the show? The official picked up a bamboo stick and hit him. He said angrily, Is His Highness Jiang of Silla's show something you can watch? The young man looked at him and said tentatively, Father, Jiang of Silla. Jiang of Silla didn't say anything and just let us leave. Nothing big happened, right? What do you know? The middle-aged man glared at him again and immediately walked out of the room. He said loudly, Someone prepare a generous gift, the thicker the better. At the same time, many official residences in the capital city had carriages full of gifts and were gathering in the same direction. Shui Mansion. Old General Shui drank the wine in his bowl and laughed. Little brat, every time you come back, you cause such a big commotion. You don't even know to come to the Shui Mansion to take a look. An old woman poured him another bowl of wine and said, His Highness Jiang of Silla's status is different now. When you see him, you can't act like this again. What's wrong with Jiang of Silla again? Old General Shui curled his lips and said, I lent the pillar that Jiang of Silla slept on when he went to court. Xing Mansion. On this day, Zheng Shichen, who was already the Minister of Revenue, changed into casual clothes and walked out of the mansion. Capital Governor's Mansion. On this day, Capital Governor Lu Dayo did not bring any attendants with him and hurriedly left. Chapter 1164. Since returning to the capital, Li Yi had been staying with the Li family, and had not returned to the Jiang of Silla estate. Today, the main gate of the Jiang of Silla estate was opened for the first time in several years. In front of the gate, there was an endless stream of carriages and sedan chairs. Most people put down their gifts and left in a hurry without even stepping through the gate. In the past few years, the Jiang of Silla estate had only left a few servants to clean the courtyard. This time, the officials and nobles of the capital had gathered, and the servants in the estate were somewhat overwhelmed. Shaning simply transferred some of the maids and servants from her princess residence over just to help them carry the gifts. Of course, not everyone put down their gifts and passed through the gate without entering. "Where's Zimo and Xiaomu?" This was the first thing Seng Shichen said after seeing Li Yi. Li Yi shook his head and said, "They're in Rui City. They didn't come back this time." Seeing the anticipation and excitement on Seng Shichen's face disappear in an instant, Li Yi glanced at Li Yi and said indifferently, "You're back." A mere minister of revenue dared to speak to him like this. After not seeing each other for a few years, Lord Seng had become a lot more arrogant. However, for the sake of Zimo and Xiaomu, Li Yi did not argue with him for his lack of manners for the time being. Lu Dao walked over quickly with an excited expression on his face and said, "Your Highness, you're back." Lord Lu's attitude was much better than his predecessors by many times. "It's been 2 months since Yizhong left the capital to investigate the unjust cases. I'm afraid he won't be back in a short time." Lu Dao looked at Li Yi and said with some regret, "He must be very happy to know that Your Highness has returned to the capital." Hearing Lu Yizhong's name, Seng Shichen looked at him and couldn't help but say, "Your Anxi County is really full of talents." Old Seng was right. Lu Dao had originally been the magistrate of Anxi County. In less than 10 years, he had climbed to the position of the capital governor. He had reached the pinnacle of being a local official. As for Lu Yi, he had been promoted from an insignificant constable to the current Minister of Justice. His position was the same as Seng Shichen's. He could be called a legend in the bureaucracy. The former magistrate of Qing, and Dong Wenyun, was now the Minister of the Right. The former Anxi County lieutenant was now a king. No one would believe that there were so many big shots in a small county. The three of them sat in the courtyard. Li Yi ordered the kitchen to prepare a few dishes and a pot of wine. Lu Dao couldn't let go of him because of his identity. Seng Shichen ignored him because he didn't see Zui Mo. After a few glasses of wine, they all started to talk. "Your Highness." Lu Dao picked up a mouthful of food and said, "Back in Qing'an Prefecture, I knew that Your Highness was not an ordinary person. The small Anxi County couldn't trap you. The luckiest thing that happened to me in my life was to be the magistrate of Anxi County." He chuckled. "That's what I thought too. After being the capital governor and the Minister of Justice for so long, I actually missed the days back in Anxi County." Lu Dao didn't have a high tolerance for alcohol. Even though it wasn't hard liquor, he was soon drunk. He leaned on the table and muttered to himself. Seng Shichen drank unhurriedly. After Lu Dao was drunk, he took another sip of wine and said slowly, "Back then, Big Brother was framed. In order to protect the Zeng family, he took all the blame. His family was destroyed. At that time, my official rank was too low, and I could only watch. Later, I climbed to the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue and repeated what that person had done to Big Brother. Later, I let him die on the road of exile. Revenge was taken, but the Zeng family was no longer the Zeng family. Later, when Zimo came to the capital, she didn't want to acknowledge me as her second uncle. She liked me so much when she was young." Seng Shichen took a big gulp of wine and smiled. "I still have to thank you for this, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." He picked up the wine pot and drank to his heart's content. Then he stood up and patted his shoulder. "Don't let Zimo be wronged. I beg of you." Seng Shichen walked away reeking of wine. Li Yi knew that he wasn't drunk. In this world, there were always some people with special plots. Princesses and empresses were considered normal. There were also sister Khan, daughter Khan, and niece Khan. Some of these people had dirty thoughts, and some were pure. They really protected and loved each other from the bottom of their hearts. Changde walked out of the backyard. His breathing was a little chaotic. This wasn't common for a grandmaster like him, unless another grandmaster forced his breathing to be chaotic. Emingzu, on the other hand, appeared calm and composed. A chrysanthemum-like smile bloomed on Changda's old face. He bowed and said, "This old servant is no longer a match for your highness." Li felt a little sad. Even Emingzu had broken through. When would his opportunity to become a grandmaster come? On second thought, even if he broke through, he wouldn't be able to defeat Chang, Su, or even Emingzu and Rui. What was the point of such a breakthrough? Li Duan held Xiao Rui's hand and ran out from the backyard. The two of them had been separated for several years, but these days, they were inseparable. When he ran past Lao Chang, he halted, bowed, and said, "Master." Xiao Rui also looked at Emingzu. Auntie. She didn't know who Changda was, so she didn't know how to greet him. She just called him master like Li Duan. Li Duan looked at Emingzu and hesitated for a moment before saying, "Auntie." Before Li Yi could correct him, he ran outside with Xiao Rui. "The Zhao Kingdom has sent an ambassador." Emingzu sat beside him and said, "In the past few months, Zhao Yi personally led the army and broke through the cities of the Zhao Kingdom with irresistible force. Now half of the Zhao Kingdom has fallen into the hands of the Qi Kingdom." Li Yi thought about it and asked, "The Zhao Kingdom wants to borrow troops?" Emingzu nodded and said, "What the courtiers mean is that although we have old grudges with the Zhao Kingdom, if the Qi Kingdom conquers the Zhao Kingdom, it will become a greater threat to us. In order to prevent the Qi Kingdom from growing stronger, we should send troops." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I'm afraid it's too late." Sending troops was not something that could be done on a whim. Not only did they have to mobilize the troops, they also had to prepare rations and pay for the troops. In addition to the long journey, by the time the troops guarding the borders received these orders, it would already be too late. This time, it could be said that Zhao Yi had made up his mind to go crazy. He was the kind of person who would kill anything that stood in his way. His expansion would eventually become a serious problem for the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom. Neither kingdom would sit by and do nothing. It was because he knew this that he sent troops so quickly, and wanted to conquer the Zhao Kingdom in the shortest time possible. When the Zhao Kingdom was completely conquered by the Qi Kingdom, it would not be easy to touch them. Emingzu nodded and said, "Even if it's too late, we have to be prepared. Once the Qi Kingdom grows stronger, they will eventually point their spear at us." Li shook his head and said, "Zhao Yi is a smart man. Without heaven's punishment and cannons, he will not send troops to the Jing Kingdom or the Wu Kingdom." The emergence of gunpowder and cannons had made the Jing Kingdom and the Wu Kingdom look like they had turned on a cheat code. In terms of military strength, they had rapidly advanced to the forefront of the world. Coupled with suitable tactics, they were almost invincible. Zhao Yi knew this very well. Without heaven's punishment, he would not dare to do so. The two of them were discussing this matter in the courtyard. Outside the courtyard, Li Duan and little Rui were sitting on the swing. Suddenly he turned his head to look at her and asked, "Little Rui, will you marry me in the future?" "Of course." The little girl turned to look at him and said matter-of-factly, "We've agreed. Are you going back on your word?" No. Li Duan hurriedly shook his head and said, "However, if you marry me in the future, you can't call that aunt anymore." "Why not?" The little girl blinked and looked at him curiously. "What else can I call you if not aunt?" "Call me mother," Li Duan thought for a moment and said. "Also the little auntie who gave you the candy just now, you can't call her little auntie. You have to call her Lil Miss like me." The affairs of the Zhao Kingdom were attended by countless important officials in the imperial court. A few days before the new year, Li Yi went out to visit a few old generals, and gave them the gifts he had received a few days ago. Then came the new year. On the third day of the first lunar month in the 5th year of Jingping, something big happened in the capital city. Even for the entire Jing Kingdom, this was a major event. On this day the empress gave birth to a baby boy. Both mother and child were safe. Chapter 1165. Li Xian was so happy that he went crazy. Seeing him stand up and sit down and stand up again with an uncontrollable excitement on his face, Li suddenly felt a little distressed for Li Xian's son. who didn't even have a name until now. His name was the Emperor. Empress Wang Qing gave birth to 2 princesses, and imperial concubine Shen Su gave birth to a princess. Li Xian's hair was about to turn white from worry. If Xiao Rui was a prince, Li Yi felt that Li Xian had already titled himself as the emperor. The next day, Li Xian announced the news that the empress's legitimate son would be the crown prince. If it wasn't for the fact that his youngest son couldn't even crawl, then the imperial edict would be the succession edict. The one who was obviously relieved was Li Han. Li Yi clearly felt that he walked a lot more briskly. Li Han was 17 years old this year, which was definitely considered young. Young people were prone to make mistakes and didn't think about things comprehensively. Most of the time, they could only see the surface. Li Xian's crown prince didn't even have teeth. Even if he was educated according to the standard of an emperor, it would take at least 10 or 20 years for him to be able to take charge. Li Xian couldn't wait for 10 or 20 years. Therefore, before Wang Qing gave birth to the crown prince, Li Xian still had a bit of face. He would take into account all aspects and not pass the throne to Li Han. Now he would not pass the throne to Li Han, but His Royal Highness Prince Jin couldn't run away. Because the crown prince was still young. When the emperor experienced the suffering of the people, he needed someone to assist him. Looking at Li Han talking to Duan Wu with a smile on his face, Li Yi couldn't bear to break his dream, so he let him sleep a little longer for the time being. This year's court meeting was not on the first day of the first lunar month. Those days were the empress's due date. In the royal family, this was a first-class event, so the date of the court meeting naturally had to be postponed. Now it was a double happiness. Li Yi originally did not want to participate in the Grand Court Assembly, but he wanted to see what Mingzi looked like wearing a phoenix crown and a phoenix cloak. She would only wear those clothes when she was in court. Shanning, who was in charge of the Women's Union and many colleges in the capital, would also appear at the Imperial Court Conference. The Qi Kingdom, the Wu Kingdom, and the Zhao Kingdom had all sent envoys to the Jing Kingdom. This time, they didn't just send envoys casually. Instead, they sent envoys to the Jing Kingdom with formal etiquette. This was probably the pinnacle of diplomatic relations in the history of the Jing Kingdom. Your Highness Jiang of Silla. Greetings, Your Highness Jiang of Silla. During the distance from the palace gate to the political hall, all the officials that Li Yi met, some of whom he knew, some of whom he did not, bowed to him. Old General Xue sighed and said, I still remember the first time you stood here a few years ago. Back then you were just a young boy. In just a few years, you are already standing in front of us, the old fellows who have been in the court for decades. The few old generals usually did not attend court, but they would not miss the annual Grand Court Assembly. Old General Ma stroked his beard, and a look of reminiscence appeared on his face. The few of us only noticed you because of Tianfa. Who would have thought that you were hiding so much more than just Tianfa? Compared to you, we are really old. Li Yi smiled and said, since ancient times, the waves behind beat the waves in front, and the waves in front die on the beach. This is normal. Old General Xue suddenly looked at him and shook his head. He said, you have changed a lot over the years, but your shamelessness has always been on par with old man Ma. Surnamed Xue, in terms of shamelessness, I am still 10 feet away from you. Li Yi smiled as he watched the two of them start their daily bickering. Then he turned around to take a look. He was sitting at the front of the court. Li Xian had sent someone to bring a chair over, but he had rejected it. From his position, there were more than 100 civil and military officials in the hall. They stood orderly, and their faces were full of smiles, mixed with a trace of pride and arrogance. Behind them, there were still countless figures outside the hall. No matter how big the legislative hall was, it could not accommodate all the officials who had come to the capital to attend the Grand Court Assembly. This was the Jing Kingdom. The Jing Kingdom that he did not have any sense of belonging to in the beginning. Now step by step, he had completely integrated into the Jing Kingdom. At a certain moment, the hundreds of officials suddenly bowed at the same time and said loudly, Welcome, Your Majesty, welcome Princess Royal. After Li Xian sat down, he raised both of his hands and said calmly, Everyone please rise. After that, it was time for the Grand Court Assembly to go through the proper procedures. Since ancient times, emperors have established themselves in order to rule over the world. They must establish a dynasty and establish the foundation of the country, so that the ancestral clan and society can rest without borders. I, the emperor, have been trembling all night and look up to my ancestor, Emolai. My legitimate son Li Zhe is a hero and belongs to the will of the heavens. I hereby abide by the first imperial edict, record the ceremony, bow down to the will of the people, and sincerely inform the heavens and the earth, the ancestral temple, and the country that I hereby confer the title of Crown Prince and appoint him as the Eastern Palace's Crown Prince. This was the first imperial edict announced by the eunuchs in the Grand Court Assembly. Li Xian's intention to shift the blame to others had been going on for several years. This little fellow, Li Zhe, became the crown prince on the first day of his birth, and became the future master of the Jing kingdom. He had only been in this world for less than 24 hours, but Li Xian had already praised him to the heavens. Words like talent and outstanding were endless. The hundreds of officials could do nothing about it, and there were countless people who looked bitter. How could they, as the officials, not know what His Majesty was thinking? However, it was not easy for the Empress to give birth to a legitimate son, so no one would raise any objection at this time. The second imperial edict was to expand the number of members of the State Affair Council. The original number of members of the State Affair Council was increased from 15 to 20. The State Affair Council was an institution proposed by the eldest princess several years ago. The members of this institution were composed of 2 prime ministers, 6 ministers, the imperial censor, the governor of the capital, and several important officials. Among them, the name of Prince Jin, Li Han, was also included. No one was allowed to monopolize the power when there was a difficult decision to be made. The members of the State Affair Council had to discuss and make a decision together, and then report it to His Majesty or the eldest princess. His Majesty had no objection to this proposal. In recent years, the decision of the State Affair Council had been passed by His Majesty and the eldest princess. To some extent, the existence of the State Affair Council allowed His Majesty to be lazy with a clear conscience. This made the hundreds of officials doubt His Majesty's intentions more than once. However, this was indeed beneficial to the country, so no one could raise any objection to it. Every member of the State Affair Council could be a prime minister. From then on, all the officials in the imperial court, and even the literati of the Jing kingdom, aimed to enter the State Affair Council. The imperial edict to appoint the crown prince and increase the number of members of the State Affair Council were the 2 most important matters. What followed was a long and tedious report from an official that everyone loved to listen to. Within these 4 hours, they would know the changes in the military, economy, politics, population, and system of the Jing kingdom in the past year. The Jing kingdom had been making progress every year. They had God's punishment and cannons, which could intimidate all the other countries. The national treasury was filled day by day, and various new policies that were beneficial to the people were introduced continuously. This was the result of the hard work of all the people present here for a year. These results would be written on the imperial board and posted on the walls of the palace, which was transparent to the people of the Jing kingdom. Li was actually not very interested in these things. He looked at Emingzu, who was sitting above him, and thought to himself, I must remind her to take this dress with her when I leave in a few days. Chapter 1166. 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, none of the officials in the hall would have imagined that one day, they would be able to witness such a grand court conference. Politics, economy, population, agriculture, commerce. Almost every aspect that they could think of was developing at a gratifying speed. In the past, they could not see the future of the Jing kingdom because they were confused. Now they still could not see the future of the Jing kingdom because the Jing kingdom's development had far exceeded their imagination. Of course, the Grand Court Conference brought not only joy but also worry to the officials. Especially after Chen Chong, the provincial governor of Shuzhou, presented the memorial, almost half of the people in the court changed their expressions. They were suspicious, shocked, incredulous, and deeply regretful. This was the first time Chen Chong, the provincial governor of Shuzhou, attended a Grand Court Conference. Regardless of whether it was the old officials who had been in the court for decades, or the new officials in the court in recent years, the name Chen Chong was no stranger to them. In the past, the Duke of Chen's household had been so illustrious. Although it could not cover the sky with one hand, in the capital, a brick thrown on the street could hit a marquee. The Chen clan was already one of the top clans. The Chen family used to be glorious. Later, because they were involved in the Cui family's rebellion, they declined overnight. Later, they completely disappeared from the capital. Some people knew that he had become the provincial governor of Shuzhou in the fief of the Jiang of Silla, but some people had completely forgotten about him. Today, this man, who was once a prominent figure in the capital, once again walked in front of the people. He brought a few pieces of news. In the past 5 years, the population of Shuzhou had officially surpassed the capital and became the most populous city in the Jing Kingdom. The tax revenue of Shuzhou last year was 20% of the tax revenue of the entire Jing Kingdom. This did not exceed the tax revenue, which saved them some face. But that was only Shuzhou. The tax revenue of Shuzhou was 20% of the tax revenue of the Jing Kingdom. This meant that Shuzhou alone was equivalent to more than 10 provinces in the Jing Kingdom. But this had nothing to do with them. Because as early as 5 years ago, the court officials unanimously discussed and almost couldn't wait to give all the tax collection rights of Shu province for the next 50 years to Jiang of Silla. They even gave the entire Shu province to Jiang of Silla. At that time, they were still wondering if they should give 2 more. At the time, they had thought that as long as he could leave the capital, anything would be fine. 5 years ago, a prefecture in the Jing Kingdom was worth more than 10 Shu prefectures. 5 years later, Shu Prefecture was worth more than 10 ordinary prefectures in the Jing Kingdom. It was more than 100 times more. It had only been 5 years. No one knew what would happen in Shuzhou in 50 years. All the officials in the hall were filled with regret. They couldn't help but turn their heads to look at the figure standing at the very front. They didn't know whether to feel fear or respect. Li Yi had been watching the progress of the Imperial Court Conference. After the officials of the various prefectures in the Jing Kingdom finished their reports, it was time for the envoys from other countries to meet the emperor. Several years ago, the Jing Kingdom was weak. The envoys of Qi and Zhao acted like they were in their own garden in the Golden Palace of the Jing Kingdom. Their words and actions were quite inappropriate. But now the situation was completely different. After presenting the generous gifts, the envoys of the small countries showed their subservience. The envoys of the Wu Kingdom didn't send any gifts. Her Majesty just sent someone to deliver a letter of credence. In the first month of the 5th year of Jinghe, the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom officially established diplomatic relations. From then on, they would be friendly neighbors, non-aggression, trade barriers would be removed, and trade with each other. The gifts sent by the envoys of the Zhao Kingdom were very generous, because they came to ask for help. The army of the Qi Kingdom was approaching the imperial city of the Zhao Kingdom. If the Jing Kingdom didn't lend a helping hand, it wouldn't take long for the Zhao Kingdom to disappear in the long river of history. Although the envoys of the Qi Kingdom were not as enthusiastic as those of the Wu Kingdom, they also expressed their intention to establish diplomatic relations. When they presented themselves, the envoys of the Zhao Kingdom kept a straight face from the beginning to the end. The Imperial Court Conference started in the morning and lasted for several hours. It didn't end until the afternoon. A few of the old generals and some of the senior officials in the court had already been given a seat by Li Xian before the court session had even begun. The younger officials, on the other hand, had been standing the entire time. When the court session ended, almost all of them were limping. It was just a few hours. Li Yi didn't feel anything. After the Imperial Court Conference was over, he was the first to leave. He didn't walk far when he heard a hurried voice behind him. "Your Highness Jiang of Silla, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." The voice was very familiar. Li Yi turned around and saw Wei Liang jogging toward him. Wei Liang came with the envoy of the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi saw him just now. It was just that it wasn't convenient to talk to him in that situation. Li Yi and Wei Liang hadn't seen each other for a long time. He smiled and asked, "How is your empress?" Wei Liang smiled and said, "Her Majesty has just ascended the throne. Everything is fine." It's just that she's a little busy with the affairs of the state every day. To wear the crown, one must bear its weight. Emingzu was like that. Yangliuking was also like that. The Wu kingdom had just settled down. There were many things waiting to be done. Of course, she would be very busy. There were many things that she had never touched before. However, he had Old Man Wang and the others to watch him. He wouldn't make any big mistakes. Brotherly, long time no see. Another voice came from his side. Li Yi turned his head and saw Yang Yanzhou, who had just walked out of the hall. He was here on behalf of Zhao Yi. His purpose was naturally to stop the Jing kingdom from helping the Zhao kingdom. However, the imperial court of the Jing kingdom had already made a decision on this. Although the Jing kingdom and the Zhao kingdom had old grudges, the Qi kingdom was ambitious. They would never let the Qi kingdom become stronger. Half a month ago, the order to stop the Qi kingdom and help the Zhao kingdom had been sent out urgently. By now, the Jing kingdom's army at the border of Qi and Zhao must have taken action. Li Yi shook his head and said, "What are you doing here instead of staying by Zhao Yi's side? Zhao Yi must know that no matter who he sends, it will be useless." Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, "I have to try to know whether it will be useful or not." "Now that you have tried, is it useful?" Yang Yanzhou shook his head with a bitter smile. Li Yi was too lazy to talk about these things. He waved his hand casually and said, "Before I came out, there was still soup in the pot. If you don't want to talk about national affairs, you can come to the mansion of Jiang of Silla when you have time." "Of course." Wei Liang waved his hand. Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, "In that case, I will pay a visit to Brother Li tomorrow." The officials who came out of the hall were surprised to see His Highness Jiang of Silla and the envoys of Qi and Wu talking cheerfully and wittily. It was obvious that this was not the first time they had met each other. They naturally did not think that Jiang of Silla had committed treason. However, even the envoys of the Qi kingdom and the Wu kingdom seemed to be on good terms with him. Whether he was in the capital or not, Jiang of Silla was still the same Jiang of Silla. An official looked at the back of Jiang of Silla disappearing. He quickly took a few steps forward and said to the slowly walking Prime Minister Shin, "Prime Minister Shin, Shu Province cannot be handed over to Jiang of Silla like this." Chapter 1167. The Shu Province of today was no longer the Shu Province of the past. The Shu Province of today was practically the largest treasury of the Jing Kingdom. In just 5 years, it had surpassed the capital in terms of population and economy. Who knew what it would be like in 50 years? A country within a country? This was something that he absolutely did not want to see. This was also something that all the officials in the court did not want to see. Even though they had unanimously decided to give Shu Province to the Jiang of Silla a few years ago. What was credibility? What a country needed was always profit. The official walked up to Shen Xiang and said hurriedly, "Just now in the hall, you must have heard what Provincial Governor Chen Chong said. The Shu Province is so rich now. The court must take it back." Shen Xiang, who had been walking slowly, stopped in his tracks. His eyes turned cloudy. He looked at the official and asked, "What did Minister Wei just say?" The middle-aged official looked at him and repeated, "We must take back Shu Province from the hands of the Jiang of Silla." Shen Xiang asked doubtfully, "The Jiang of Silla? What's wrong with the Jiang of Silla?" The middle-aged official moved closer to him and raised his voice. "The Jing Kingdom's Shu Province cannot fall into the hands of the Jiang of Silla again." Shen Xiang asked in surprise, "Shu Province? What's wrong with Shu Province?" The middle-aged official was speechless. Shen Xiang pointed at his ears and smiled. "I'm getting old. My ears don't work so well anymore. Minister Wei, please don't blame me. I was thinking a few days ago that these old bones of mine really couldn't hold on any longer. I was planning to resign from His Majesty in a few months." The middle-aged official was shocked. He immediately said, "Prime Minister Shen is the pillar of the court. You are a role model for us officials. If you leave, who else can suppress the treacherous officials in the court?" Shen Xiang sighed and looked at the middle-aged official. He said, "For a country, although benefits are the most important, we can't just care about the benefits in front of us. We have to live up to our own conscience and the conscience of the world." The official opened his mouth, Prime Minister Shen. Without the treacherous officials you speak of, there wouldn't be today's Jing Kingdom, and there wouldn't be today's Minister of Wei. Xin Xiang looked at him. His back was no longer bent, and his eyes were no longer turbid. He spoke again. His Majesty hasn't said anything. Minister Wei, you don't have to worry about these things. Before Prime Minister Shen left, he looked at him again and said, Today the people standing in the court already owe him too much. We can't owe any more. If we owe any more, I'm afraid we will suffer retribution. After Xin Xiang left, the middle-aged official stood there in a daze. He only felt that his throat was a little dry. He licked his dry lips. Xin Xiang's words were very clear. If he insisted on targeting Jiang of Silla, Xin Xiang would not help him. At that moment, he finally realized that Jiang of Silla was much more terrifying than he had imagined. However, he was only thinking about the Jing Kingdom. What did he do wrong? Confusion and hesitation appeared on his face. He slowly took a step forward and disappeared in the direction of the palace gate alone. When Li Yi came out, the pot was really stewing soup. The soup had been stewing for a few hours, and the taste was very rich. Ever since he realized that he had underestimated Emingzu, he picked up the skills that he had put aside for many years. She only had a low starting point, but there was a lot of room for her to grow, far beyond Li Yi's imagination. Shanning ran over and said pitifully, I also want to drink Royal Sister's soup, but she won't give it to me. Li Yi patted her head and said, Your Royal Sister has to deal with so many affairs of the country every day. She needs to nourish her body. I'll make your favorite soup later. The soup that Emingzi drank naturally couldn't be given to Shanning. It wasn't because she didn't need it, but she was only 18 years old. At the very least, it would take a few more years for Li Yi's beastly and guilty feelings to dispel. After finishing the soup for the two of them, he still had to do other things. This time, when he left the capital city, he would come back to accompany Emingzi and Shanning. He wouldn't make such a big fuss. Therefore, the Jiang of Silla residence, which had always only accepted gifts but not given gifts, was finally generous for a while. Today Li Yi held a banquet in the residence. It wasn't a big banquet, but he sent invitations to all who he thought needed to say goodbye. The first person to visit was Lu Yi. He had just finished patrolling the Beijing-Hebei region. After entering the small courtyard, he quickly walked up to him with a slightly excited face. Your Excellency, you're back. When he was still a county lieutenant, Lu Yi called him Your Excellency. This form of address had almost never changed over the years. Li Yi habitually patted him on the shoulder and said with a smile, You're already a minister. Show some of the minister's manner and aura. The minister of the Ministry of Justice, who had always been impartial and upright, showed an embarrassed expression at this moment. Lu Dao and Seng Shichen visited him at the same time. Both of them came from the Anqi County government, so they naturally contacted each other frequently in the past few years. For some reason, Seng Shichen also hooked up with the two of them. Two ministers and a governor of the capital city had already occupied 3 seats in the State Affairs Council. As soon as Lu Dao and Seng Shichen sat down, Li Yi heard a rough voice. Ha ha ha, little Li, I've known you for so many years, but this is the first time I've taken advantage of you. Today, take out all the good wine in your residence. I want to drink to my heart's content. Little brat, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You must treat me with good wine and good dishes. It was rare for old General Shui and old General Ma to be united. There was no question of who was bigger or smaller, or who could urinate higher or further. It seemed that they were ready to make a killing on Li Yi. Li Yi smiled and said, Rest assured, old generals. Today, I will personally cook and treat you well. Li Han had originally planned to sneak out with Duan Wu, but Li Yi conveniently grabbed him as a helper. In the entire capital, Li Yi really could not find a more qualified roaster than him. The fish caught from the lake of the Mathematics Institute were still fresh, and there was no shortage of sauce. All that was left was Li Han. Dong Wenyun came together with the Shen family and the Wang family. Dong Wenyun was the son-in-law of the Shen family. The Shen family could be considered as one family with 2 prime ministers and an imperial concubine in the palace. However, the Wang family's empress gave birth to the crown prince. It was hard to say who would be the final winner. However, at least on the surface, they seemed to be in harmony. There were also some relatives of the Li family, but there were only a few of them. Wei Liang and Yang Yanzhou also chose to freeload today. Li Yi reckoned that he had to find a few helpers. Otherwise, he would not be able to handle so many people at once. Today the Jiang of Silla residence, from the inside to the outside, from the master to the servants, everyone was exceptionally busy. Wei Xian stood at the entrance of the Jiang of Silla residence and hesitated for a long time. He did not know whether he should step in or not. After he returned, he thoroughly investigated the information about the Jiang of Silla. The results of the investigation made him unable to sleep for the entire night. His poetry was unparalleled. Even an uneducated child could recite a few sentences. Every word of his could be sold at a sky-high price. He had never seen anyone whose calligraphy was sold at a price of a word. He had reached the peak of what a scholar could achieve. He improved the art of interrogation by torture, and reduced the number of cruel officials in the Jing kingdom. He offered the horseshoes and created the Heavenly Punishment Society. The army of the Jing kingdom was invincible and invincible. With his own strength, he repelled the diplomatic mission of the Qi kingdom, and preserved the dignity of the Jing kingdom. He established the School of Mathematics, and started a new School of Mathematics. He eliminated a large number of vermin in the court, the politics, economy, military, commerce, agriculture of the Jing kingdom. As long as Wei Xian could think of it, the shadow of Jiang of Silla could be seen. Because of this, he was trusted by the emperors of 2 dynasties. He became the youngest minister of the imperial court in history, and the only foreign official in the history of the Jing kingdom to be conferred the title of prince. He had also reached the peak of what an official could achieve. Such a person should be valued by the emperors. However, due to various reasons, he left the capital city for 5 years. Wei Xian admired the Jiang of Silla very much. He even prostrated himself before him. Wei Xian admitted that the officials had wronged him. However, Xuzhou was the Jing kingdom's Xuzhou, not the Jiang of Silla's Xuzhou. He handed the name card to the concierge and said, "Please report that I, Wei Xian, request to meet the Jiang of Silla." Chapter 1168. The gatekeeper of the Jiang of Silla residence was especially busy today. Usually only one person was needed to guard the door, but today there were 5 people on duty. Those who came to the residence today were either high-ranking officials or dignitaries. His Highness could afford to neglect them, but the gatekeeper could not. Hearing that the visitor reported his official title as minister in charge, one of the gatekeepers immediately became alert. He accepted the name card and stepped forward. "Sir, please come in." Today, some people who came to the Jiang of Silla residence would hand over their name cards and invitations according to the rules, but some people swaggered in, such as the old generals just now. They did not need to check the invitations one by one. In the entire capital, no one dared to freeload or cause trouble during the banquet of the Jiang of Silla residence. The gatekeeper led him through more than half of the residence, pointed to a courtyard in front and said, "This lowly one will escort you here. Sir, can go in by yourself." Wei Xian took a deep breath and stepped in. Then he saw such a scene. Old General Ma pointed at old General Shue's nose and scolded, "You old thing, there are only 2 drumsticks in total, and you actually want to monopolize them." Old General Shue had a drumstick in his mouth, but he was not to be outdone and scolded back. "Old thing, you still have the nerve to scold me? Just now, that jar of 30 years old wine was completely drunk by you. Did I say anything?" Old General Shue and Old General Ma were pointing at the sky and scolding each other. Right Prime Minister Dong Wenyun and Minister of Revenue Tseng Shichen clinked their glasses. The person lying under the table and being carried into the room was the capital governor, Lu Dayo. Minister of Justice Lu Yishui was serving dishes to the old generals. The 2 people in the innermost area should be the envoys of the Wu kingdom and the Qi kingdom. If he was not mistaken, the one squatting there grilling fish and crying because of the smoke was the Dean of the Divinity Academy, Prince Jin Lihan. From his angle, he could see the kitchen. The figure bustling about in the kitchen was none other than Jiang of Silla. Beside him were Princess Shaning and Princess Royal. Wei Xian did a rough count. More than half of the 20 members of the State Council were here. 1 prime minister, 2 ambassadors, 3 ministers, and 4 old generals. In this small courtyard, more than half of the core forces in the imperial court of the Jing kingdom had gathered. Hey, Lord Wei is here too. Why are you so late? Come sit here. Dong Wenyun's voice came from beside him. Wei Xian turned his head and was pulled to the table in a daze. He opened his mouth. Prime Minister Dong. Dong Wenyun smiled and said, "There's no Prime Minister Dong here, and we're not talking about national affairs today. Let's drink, let's drink." After saying that, the wine glass in front of Wei Xian was filled to the brim. Li Yi was busy in the kitchen alone. He was cursing these bastards in his heart. They were indeed unreliable. His Emingzu and Shanning were still the most considerate. When the last dish was out of the pot, he washed his hands and walked out of the kitchen. Li Xian's figure came in time from outside the courtyard. Not only him, but his empress and imperial concubine were also there. Li Xian had always been good at timing. It was neither early nor late. He used to freeload alone, but now his whole family came together. Since his daughter had been freeloaded by his family, he would let him freeload again this time. Your Majesty, Your Majesty, Your Majesty, and imperial concubine. At several banquets in the courtyard, even those who were drunk instantly sobered up and immediately stood up to salute. Li Xian waved his hand and said, "You don't have to be so polite today. You can eat your own." Although he said so, it didn't matter whether he came or not. Now no one dared to be presumptuous. Even the 2 old generals' quarreling voices were much lower. Li Xian and his empress and imperial concubine naturally had to sit in the room. Emingzu and Shanning were at the same table with them. Li Han, who had just gotten rid of his mission of grilling fish, could only sigh and squat back to grill another fish. "You invited guests, but you didn't call me." Li Xian was quite dissatisfied with this. Li Yi would rather brag to the 2 old generals than let Li Xian come and spoil everyone's mood. He had a feeling that the number of times he would be spoiled by Li Xian in the future would increase. Li Xian picked up a mouthful of food and looked at Li Yi. He asked, "When are you leaving?" "After the 15th. Li Yi thought for a moment. He didn't want to stay in the capital for too long. Li Xian sighed and said, "I don't think I'll leave so soon. I'll at least wait until Zhe is 1 year old." Li Yi looked at him warily and asked, "Where are you going?" "Shu." Li Xian said matter-of-factly, "I plan to move the Academy of Sciences there when the time comes. Build me another base in Rui City." Up until now, Li still hadn't figured out why Li Xian was able to say such shameless things so easily. Did he kidnap his daughter or sister? Even if he did kidnap his daughter or sister, wasn't his request too much? Li looked at him and asked, "You don't want to be the emperor anymore?" Li Xian glanced at him and said, "Don't you have the crown prince?" Li looked behind him. Li Xian's crown prince was lying on the bed asleep with 4 palace maids watching over him. "Your crown prince can decide the affairs of the country for you? Don't you have the State Affairs Council? What if the State Affairs Council can't decide?" "Brother, sir, the fish is here." Li Han brought the grilled fish over. Li looked at Li Han and didn't say anything. Li Xian picked up a piece of fish and looked at Li Yi. He suddenly said, "I plan to make Duanwu a princess. What do you think?" Hearing Duanwu's name, Li Han immediately pricked up his ears. Li shook his head. "I don't have any objections. Duanwu and Xiaohan are a perfect match. However, she has the status of a princess. If she marries Xiaohan, others won't gossip about her." Li Xian looked at Li Han and asked, "Xiaohan, you're going to be 18 soon. Brother plans to betroth Duanwu to you. It's time for you to fulfill your marriage with the Wang family. Why don't we do it together?" Li Han was overjoyed, but his face was serious. "It's all up to you, brother." Li Xian nodded his head and said, "Brother has to go out for a while. Zhe is too young to be the crown prince. As his uncle, you should help him. Brother plans to let you be the regent for the time being. What do you think?" Li Han picked up a piece of fish and almost dropped it on the ground. It turned out to be a multiple-choice question. A. Marry Duanwu and Ling, or B. Regent. This was not a single-choice question. Either A and B choose at the same time, or neither. Li Han took a deep breath and sighed. It's all up to you, brother. The officials in the courtyard didn't know that their emperor used a meal to change the structure of the Jing kingdom for the next few years, or even more than 10 years. There are gains and losses. The current Prince Jin, the future Prince Regent, will regard this truth as the true meaning of life for a long time. The banquet ended earlier than Li Yi expected. Because of Li Xian, the officials present all took their leave after eating and drinking their fill. Li Yi stood in the courtyard side and said, "Why do you think the late emperor passed the throne to you?" Li Xian looked depressed. "I don't want to." A figure crawled out from under the table. He patted the dust on his body and bowed. "This official greets your majesty and Jiang of Silla." Li looked at him. "This is Wei Xian, Minister of Revenue." Li Xian looked at him and said in surprise, "You don't know the guest you invited?" Li didn't know this Minister of Revenue. It was reasonable to say that a dignified Minister of Revenue shouldn't be here for a meal. Li looked at him and asked, "Minister Wei, what's the matter?" Today Wei Xian ate the chicken cooked by Jiang of Silla and the fish roasted by Prince Jin. He also saw the many ministers and pillars of the court. Standing in this small courtyard and standing in the main hall was a completely different side. He also heard the conversation between His Majesty and Jiang of Silla. This official admires His Highness Jiang of Silla very much. He took a step back and bowed to Li Yi. "I heard that His Highness is leaving." This official came uninvited to see His Highness off. "I hope His Highness doesn't mind." Chapter 1169. Since the day the Crown Prince was born, the capital city had been immersed in jubilation. This kind of jubilation would probably last until the Lantern Festival. In the days before the Lantern Festival, the court was usually not in session, but this year, there were many government decrees. The first was naturally the crowning of the Crown Prince, which was a major event related to the livelihood of the people. Then the court announced to the public that they would help the Zhao Kingdom, helping the Zhao Kingdom to resist the Qi Kingdom. The formal establishment of diplomatic relations with the Wu Kingdom. From then on, the two countries would be equal and mutually beneficial, which could be regarded as the third major event. Zhao Yi's plan failed, and Yang Yanzhou was about to return in vain. "This time, I'm afraid I can't see you off, Brother Li." Yang Yanzhou would leave in 3 days, and Li Yi would stay a few days longer than him. Li looked at him and shook his head, saying, "Isn't it good to stay obediently in your Qi Kingdom? Why do you have to go through so much trouble?" Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, "His Majesty often said that a person's life is only a short few decades. Once it's over, you can't go back. Since that's the case, you might as well be bold, see the people you want to see, do the things you want to do, and live in this world not in vain." Why didn't Li Yi realize before that Zhao Yi had the potential to be a philosopher, and a chicken soup philosopher? However, that was his business. A queen lover was not qualified to laugh at an emperor lover. Zhao Yi was free to do whatever he wanted. He nodded and said, "Then I wish him good luck." Yang Yanzhou nodded and said, "Since His Majesty ascended to the throne, he has been working day and night and has been sick. He has caught a cold for several months and hasn't recovered. I hope Brother Li's auspicious words." Wei Liang left the second day after Yang Yanzhou's departure. Both the Wu Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom had just stabilized their regimes, but the two countries were walking in completely different directions. Zhao Yi wanted to strengthen the country through external expeditions, while Yang Liuqing wanted to take the path of stability and peace. This was also the plan that Li Yi had formulated for her from the beginning. By the time we left, the citizens of the country were almost completely loyal to His Majesty. When His Majesty entered the capital, some of the large clans in the capital provided great assistance. If not for that, we would not have been able to take down the capital so quickly. Wei Liang said. Then he shook his head and said, "However, after His Majesty ascended to the throne, those large clans united and formed many constraints on His Highness. The Wu Kingdom was different from the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. During the uprising in Yangliuqing, he made use of the contradictions between the landlords and the peasants, and between the aristocratic families and the country gentry. Basically speaking, the interests of the aristocratic families were at stake. Under this historical background, It was impossible for those large clans that occupied a large amount of resources to be completely wiped out. There needed to be a balance between them, and this balance was not so easy to achieve. A few days ago, Li Yi had already received the news that Rui had gone to the Wu Kingdom. After the matter in the capital was settled, they would first return to Rui City and stay for a few days before going to the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi nodded and said, "In a few days I will go to the capital to take a look." A look of joy appeared on Wei Liang's face as he said, "That couldn't be better." After Wei Liang left, Li Yi also walked out of the small courtyard. Voices came from the roof. "Xiao Rui, I'm leaving soon. You have to miss me. Father said that when my brother grows up a little, I will be able to go and find you. How old will you be when you grow up a little?" "Oh my, very soon. In a month? At the very least, I'll have to wait for a year." "Ah, that's a long time." "It's a little long, but by then, we will have already grown up. Why don't you marry me? Then we won't have to be separated." "Okay." "What if Uncle Li doesn't agree? Then we will elope." Li Yi did not know that the eldest young master of the Li family had already planned to elope with the eldest princess. He left the prince's mansion and went to the imperial palace. He and Emingzu stood in front of a palace. This was an independent palace, surrounded by a high outer wall, forming an enclosed courtyard. In fact, there were not many people living in the imperial palace. Li Xian and the others lived in Hibiscus Garden. So did the Empress Dowager and old princess. The other concubines of the former emperor were also arranged by Li Xian to live in other courtyards. The imperial palace had become a cage. And this palace was a cage within a cage. Naturally, there would be prisoners in the cage. "Let me out, you traitors, traitors! Save me, save me! Where are the imperial guards? Come and save me! Open the door for me, I want to go to the imperial court. The imperial court cannot do without me, the Jing kingdom cannot do without me." This was a voice that Li Yi had almost forgotten. When the king of Shu was captured, he pretended to be crazy. Li Xian kept him here, so he did not have to worry about food and drink. Every once in a while he would send some books in to relieve his boredom. But he was not allowed to step out of the palace. This palace door, except for a small hole at the bottom for delivering food and other things, had not been opened for a long time. Li Emingzu looked at a eunuch in front and said, "Open the door." "Yes." The eunuch took out a key from his pocket, inserted it into the keyhole, and opened the lock. Li Yi walked forward, put one hand on the door and pushed it open. Creak, soon, a heavy, almost decaying sound was heard. A man sat in the front courtyard. His clothes were messy, his hair was unkempt, and his face was dirty. He looked like a beggar. He looked at the open door in a daze, and an ecstatic expression appeared on his face. He said happily, "Is someone here to save me? When I get out, I will make you the prime minister." He quickly got up from the ground and ran outside. Halfway through, he saw a figure in front of the door. He suddenly stopped in his tracks, and an expression of extreme horror appeared on his face. It was as if he had seen a man-eating demon. He ran back at a faster speed than when he came, ran into the main hall, and quickly closed the door. "Don't come over, don't come over." An extremely terrified voice came from inside the palace door. Li Yi did not force his way in, although it was very easy for him. He stood at the door for a moment, put a jar of wine in front of the door, and left with Emingzu. After an unknown period of time, the palace door slowly opened. The king of Shu leaned against the door and picked up the jar of wine. After a moment of shock, he pulled out the cork and gulped it down. The wine poured down his neck. He looked up and laughed, but tears came out of his eyes. He suddenly smashed the wine jar and shouted, "I want to see Li Xian." The king of Shu no longer clamored to be the emperor. He walked out of the prison-like palace and entered a mausoleum. In that mausoleum, he was no longer restricted. It was a royal cemetery. After noble concubine Cui hanged herself, Li Xian specially allowed her to be buried there. Except for the empress, the concubines, and the especially favored concubines, all the concubines of the past emperors were buried there. And Li Yi was in the real imperial mausoleum. He brought a large jar of wine, a few dishes, and a bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup. The temperature of the white fungus and lotus seed soup was a little too high, and the white fungus was boiled apart, which affected the taste. With Li Yi's cooking skills, he should not have made such a mistake. However, the first meal that the former emperor treated him to was this taste. Changde stood behind him, slightly absent-minded. Opposite Li Yi, there was a set of bowls and chopsticks, but no one was sitting there. He smiled and said, "Your Majesty, I hope you don't mind that I brought food and wine to see you after such a long time." He opened the jar of wine and poured half of it on the ground. "The Jing kingdom is getting better and better, and this is all thanks to you. Li Xian doesn't want to be the emperor, and I can't force him. I may not be able to do what I promised you in the past. Also, I admit that you are very wise, but you really gave birth to a silly son. But your daughters are all very good." Li Yi muttered to himself as he continued to drink. Before he knew it, he had finished the remaining half of the jar of wine. He was drunk and leaned on the table murmuring, "Usually no one dares to bring wine here. This time, you can drink to your heart's content. In the future, I will try to visit you once a year. Don't kick me in my sleep again." You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.